Chapter 83. After the duel, the sun had long disappeared into the horizon, and a bright moon rose slowly from the east, where the sky and the water met. Half of the myriad red river was green and the other half red. Against the wavering shadow of the moon in the water, a lonely thought emerged out of thin air. A middle-aged man, no taller than 7 feet, clad in an ordinary burlap white robe, was walking slowly from the lower reaches of the river towards them with his hands clasped behind his back. He walked on the myriad red river as if he was walking on flat ground. Wherever his bare feet passed, a 3-inch deep footprint would be left on the surface of the river. No matter how the river rolled and flowed, these footprints were clearly imprinted on the surface of the river, and did not dissipate even after a long time. Looking at the footprints on the surface of the river, Wu Qi had goosebumps all over his body. This was the unique sign of a cultivator of Jin Dan realm. When a cultivator formed the Jin Dan realm, he or she would step into the realm of human immortals, with one foot detached from the 5 elements and the realm of mortals. They stood on the dividing line between human immortals and human immortals. Half of them were human immortals, and the other half were immortals. In a human immortal of Jin Dan realm, the conflict between the great Tao of heaven and earth was very obvious, and the external signs were all kinds of unusual signs. Some immortals carried a strange fragrance, while some immortals were surrounded by colorful clouds. Wherever this white-robed man passed, his footprints would be left on the surface of the river, which was also a kind of unusual sign. This was a sign that could be seen with naked eyes, and Wu Qi's divine sense told him that this white-robed man, who was walking slowly from a few miles away, was emanating a sword intent that was as sharp as a cold wind in the winter, and as sharp as a well-tempered blade. Wherever he passed, the sword intent seemed to split the void. This was the unusual sign on the spiritual level of a human immortal of Jin Dan realm. Without sufficient cultivation base and soul force, no one could sense the sword intent emanating from his body. Step by step, Nye Baihong, the current sect leader of heaven-breaking swordsmanship sect, came to the deck of Heaven Music Immortal Palace. When his bare feet touched the deck, the footprints that stretched for several miles on the surface of the river behind him disappeared one after another. When the footprints spread out, the fishes, shrimps, turtles, red leaves, and petals in the river nearby were all crushed to pieces by the invisible sword energy. More than 30 young masters from influential clans rushed out from the crowd and came before Nye Baihong in a disorderly manner. One after another, they dropped to their knees and kowtowed to Nye Baihong. Some of these young masters addressed Nye Baihong as sect master, some addressed him as grand master, and some even addressed him as supreme ancestor. The seniority of all these people was extremely diverse, and it caused Wu Qi to roll his eyes. Taking advantage of this chaotic situation, a few guards of Taba Haofeng hastily carried their master, who had been frozen into a block of ice, and stealthily sneaked off the pleasure boat. After that, they boarded the speedboat and quickly left the place. As Wu Qi was about to give the order to kill Tuoba Haofeng and his men, Nye Baihong suddenly gave him a look. A chill ran through Wu Qi's body, as if both his flesh and soul were slashed by a heavy sword. A buzzing sound kept ringing in his head, and he didn't come back to his senses for a long time. With just an indifferent glance, Wu Qi could tell that Chi-Chi's internal organs had suffered serious injuries. It was as if countless sharp blades were gently slicing through his internal organs, causing tiny cracks to appear on them, with blood oozing out bit by bit. He felt a sweet taste in his throat, as a mouthful of blood rolled up to his throat. Wu Qi took a deep breath and swallowed it back down. The reverse flow of blood had attacked his heart. Not only did Wu Qi spit out a mouthful of blood, he forcefully swallowed it back down. The innate energy in his body which had just recovered a little was thrown into chaos instantly, causing his internal injuries to worsen. His internal organs were shaken by the reverse flow of blood that he forcefully swallowed, and the cracks on his internal organs became even deeper. Eventually, Wu Qi still couldn't control the injuries in his body, causing him to spit out 3 mouthfuls of blood in a row. The blood he spat out was bright red, bringing with it a pungent smell of blood. It seemed that his prime energy essence had been damaged, and his injuries were extremely serious. Fortunately, Wu Qi had a strong foundation, and the amount of blood essence stored in his body was a few times greater than ordinary people. For ordinary people, these few mouthfuls of blood would require them to stay in bed for at least a few months, but he would only need a few days to recuperate. Coldly looking at the blood Wu Qi spat out on the deck, Nia Baiheng snorted lightly. Those young masters from influential clans who came forward to greet Nia Baiheng rose to their feet hastily, holding their heads up high and lining up neatly according to their seniority in heaven-breaking sword sect. Nia Baiheng nodded his head lightly. From the corner of his eyes, he gazed at Lu Qingfeng, who was standing by the window at the highest point of the banquet hall. Slowly, he raised his hand and bowed to Lu Qingfeng, saying, "Greetings, Duke Yanlu." Lu Qingfeng floated down and landed on the deck. He gave Wu Qi a worried look, then hastily cupped his fist and bowed to Nia Baiheng, saying, "Qingfeng offers greetings, sect leader. May I know what brings sect leader here today?" Indifferently, Nia Baiheng gazed at Lu Qingfeng and said with a cold voice, "Just like what I said just now, I'm here to accept Wu Qi as my disciple." Nia Baiheng turned to look at Wu Qi and said with a deep voice, "Among the 13 immortal sects of Great Yan Dynasty, the overall strength of heaven-breaking sword sect is rank number 1, and my cultivation base is at the later stage of Jin Dan realm. Today, I'm here to accept you as my disciple, and this is your good fortune. Quickly come up here and kowtow to me as your master. I don't want to stay in such a filthy place for too long." Before Nia Baiheng could finish his words, a beautiful teenage girl, who looked to be about 15 or 16 years old, was irritated by the cold air contained in the sword beam unleashed by Wu Qi just now. She felt an itch in her nose, and suddenly sneezed. Nia Baiheng's expression changed. He spun his head and glared at the teenage girl. A crisp sound of ripping rang out in the air, as the teenage girl's body was suddenly split into two from the middle. Her blood and flesh exploded and splattered on the floor of those people around her. A dead silence fell over the deck, especially those girls on the pleasure boats. Each of them had their hands tightly covering their mouths, and none of them dared to utter a single word. Among them, there were a few dancers who had a good relationship with the teenage girl. Although they were grief-stricken and frightened to death, they could only bite their own palms tightly, and let big drops of tears fall from their eyes, not daring to make a single sound. Even these young masters from influential clans on the spot could kill them, and they could take away the lives of all the girls on this pleasure boat at any time, let alone Nia Baiheng. He was the sect leader of an immortal sect, and these young masters from influential clans were just his juniors and apprentices. The life of a mere dancer was nothing in this situation. Abruptly, Lu Qingfeng clenched both his hands into fists. He gave Nia Baiheng a quick glance, then slowly lowered his head. The dancer who was killed just now was not far away from him. A large amount of blood splashed onto Lu Qingfeng's soft brocade boots. Soaked in the blood, the green boots turned into a strange dark green color. Lu Qingfeng could feel the warm blood sticking to his feet, and it was slowly turning cold. Abruptly, Wu Qi took a step forward. He looked at the dead body of the teenage girl, clenched his teeth and stared at Nia Baiheng as he asked, "What crime did she commit?" As if he had just heard the most unbelievable joke in the world, Nia Baiheng looked at Wu Qi in astonishment and asked, "Do I need to convict her? She was disrespectful when I was speaking, and that is a capital crime." "But, why would you ask me such a question? Do I need an excuse to kill a lowly peasant?" Abruptly, the little bit of innate water energy left in Wu Qi's water meridians was activated, but immediately, a severe pain came from his internal organs, which nearly made him faint. His internal organs were still bleeding. When he forcibly circulated his internal energy, it was like a juicer, as the pressure forced his internal organs to secrete more blood. Wu Qi's vision darkened, his body swayed, and he nearly fell to the ground. Suddenly, a bright smile emerged on his pale face. Blinking his eyes, Wu Qi looked at Nia Baiheng with a gentle expression. Respectfully, he walked before Nia Baiheng. Forcing himself to keep himself from fainting, Wu Qi dropped to his knees before Nia Baiheng, and gave him a few kowtows. "Your disciple pays respect to master. It is my good fortune in my previous life to be able to receive guidance from Master. What Master said is absolutely right. For a lowly peasant like her, it doesn't matter if she dies. Indeed, she doesn't need to be charged with any crime. With a respectful and even slightly admiring smile on his face, Wu Qi stared at Nia Baihong with an innocent and naive look, whose expression had become very gentle. With a bright smile on his face, he asked, "But, I have no idea why Master would come here and take me as your disciple. I've long heard about the reputation of heaven-breaking swordsmanship sect. But, even in my dreams, I never dared to dream that I could become your disciple." The flattery made Nia Baihong feel comfortable from the bottom of his heart. The fact that he had just killed a dancer was like a drop of water sliding across an ice-cold diamond, leaving no trace in his heart. Looking at Wu Qi, whose face was filled with a smile, and whose eyes were filled with admiration, respect, and awe, Nia Baihong nodded satisfyingly. "Well, this is your good fortune. If not for Princess Zhanglu personally sending someone to beg me, I wouldn't have made an exception and accepted you as my disciple." Princess Zhanglu had actually sent someone to beg Nia Baihong to accept Wu Qi as his disciple. Wu Qi's heart trembled. Once again, he owed Princess Zhanglu a favor. But, never in his wildest dreams did he expect that the master that Princess Zhanglu had found for him out of kindness was actually someone like Nia Baihong. The moment they met, he had given Wu Qi a show of strength, nearly shattering his internal organs. Furthermore, he had secretly protected Tuoba Haofeng, allowing Tuoba Haofeng to escape smoothly. Then, he had even killed an innocent girl right in front of Wu Qi because of a trivial matter. It was better not to have such a master. However, facing the formidable sword energy emanating from Nia Baihong's body, Wu Qi's smile became even more amiable and adorable. Then, he kowtowed to Nia Baihong and said smilingly, "So, it's Princess Zhang Li's kindness. Disciple finally understands now. Thank you, Master, for coming here personally. Even if I have to sacrifice myself and break all my bones, I won't be able to repay your kindness." Nia Baihong felt more and more satisfied. Wu Qi's flattery had made him feel very comfortable. After all, which young master from those influential clans would say such flattering words to Wu Qi? Finally, a trace of a smile was squeezed out from Nia Baihong's stiff face. Slowly, he fished out a long sword from his storage ring and casually handed it over to Wu Qi. "Well, from today onwards, you're a disciple of heaven-breaking sword sect, one of my direct disciples. From now on, you'll come to Mount White Sun for a lecture at the beginning of every month. During the rest of the time, you're free to do whatever you want. I'll give you this sword. Take good care of it." Patting on Wu Qi's shoulder, Nia Baihong threw a thin palm-sized book called Qi Circulating Technique of 5 Elements to Wu Qi. After that, he spun around and flew away. He walked quickly on the surface of the river, leaving a trail of footprints on the surface of the river. Very soon, he disappeared into the distance. Nia Baihong's voice was heard coming from afar. "The Qi circulating technique of 5 elements is the foundation of our sect's sword technique. Cultivate it diligently, and don't slack off. Anyone who secretly teaches it to an outsider will be killed without mercy. Anyone who covets the secret technique will have his entire clan executed. You must remember this." Reverently, Wu Qi picked up the thin book, bowed towards the direction where Nia Baihong had left. When he bowed, Wu Qi's eyes suddenly turned bloodshot, and his face was filled with a ferocious expression. When he straightened his back, his face was once again wearing the smile of a spring breeze. Chapter 84. On the small lake in the backyard of Duke Yen Li's mansion, Wu Qi was lying quietly in a small boat. He had memorized the Qi circulating technique of 5 elements by heart, liver, lung, spleen, and kidney, and had begun his preliminary cultivation. Using the heart, liver, lungs, spleen, and kidney as the core, 5 vast streams of energy were flowing through Wu Qi's 8 extraordinary meridians and 12 principal meridians. The Qi circulating technique of 5 elements was the most traditional method of laying the foundation for a cultivator. It was to refine the essence of the blood and flesh into the innate energy, nurture the 5 internal organs, give birth to the 5 elements, and nurture the innate energy of 5 elements, strengthening the innate foundation of cultivating the Tao hidden in the 5 internal organs. With the innate energy of 5 elements, the innate spirit seed would grow into spirit sprout and spirit root, laying the foundation for the Tao of immortals. If it were some other warriors of Xiantian realm who wanted to cultivate the qi circulating technique of 5 elements, they would have to change the circulation route of the innate energy in their meridians, and this would be a huge trouble. For warriors who could cultivate to the realm of Xiantian realm, the circulation route of the innate energy in their meridians had already formed a fixed pattern, and had even fused with their blood and spirit. If they wanted to change the circulation route of the innate energy, it would be like trying to change the track of a speeding train, and it would be extremely difficult. Therefore, ordinary immortal sects were only willing to accept disciples who did not cultivate. Warriors of peak stage Hotian realm were already the limit. For a warrior like Wu Qi who had stepped into the realm of Xiantian realm, if not because of Princess Zhang Li's great influence, it would be impossible for Nie Baihong to accept him as a disciple. Putting everything else aside, if a warrior of Xiantian realm wanted to cultivate the qi circulating technique of 5 elements, it would take him at least 3 to 5 years of hard work. That was the reason why Nie Baihong left a cultivation manual to Wu Qi casually, as he didn't think highly of Wu Qi's future in cultivation. He was just giving face to Princess Shanglo, and that was why he came to accept Wu Qi as his disciple. As for whether Wu Qi could achieve any results in his cultivation, it had nothing to do with him. But for Wu Qi, it was not a problem at all. The technique he was cultivating came from the scroll of stealing, and the core meridians he cultivated were the 7 stealing heaven meridians in both of his arms. As for the 8 extraordinary meridians and 12 standard meridians in his body, they were completely empty, without any innate energy left in them. He only needed to follow the qi circulating technique of 5 elements to absorb a bit of the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, and use his spiritual sense, which was several times more powerful than an ordinary person's, to guide the spiritual energy to circulate in his meridians for 36 cycles, thus laying a solid foundation for the qi circulating technique of 5 elements. The meridians in Wu Qi's body were unobstructed, and the width and strength of his meridians were dozens of times that of an ordinary person. In just a few days of cultivation, his cultivation of the qi circulating technique of 5 elements had reached the level of 30 years, and he had achieved a preliminary balance of the minor 5 elements in his 5 viscera. With the nourishment of the genuine qi of 5 elements, Wu Qi could clearly sense that there was a vigorous vitality growing in his internal organs with his soul sense. As long as his cultivation of the qi circulating technique of 5 elements broke through to the Xiantian realm, he would be able to nurture the spirit sprouts and spirit roots in his 5 viscera, which were brought about by his innate spirit seed. That would lay the foundation for him to pursue the Tao of immortality. However, to be honest, in Wu Qi's opinion, although the qi circulating technique of 5 elements could allow one to reach the peak stage of Xiantian realm, it was too crude and shallow. No matter it was the quality of the cultivated innate energy, the speed of accumulating innate energy, or the effect of nurturing and nourishing the 5 viscera, they were all very weak. Compared to the techniques found in the Source of Water chapter, the qi circulating technique of 5 elements was just trash, the kind of trash that had been soaked in the latrine for several dozens of years. So, this is the basic qi cultivating technique that Heaven-Breaking Sword sect is so proud of. He laughed mockingly, casually shoving the small booklet into his storage ring. After that, Wu Qi took out the long sword given to him by Nie Baihong. The long sword had a pale green hue, and its blade looked like a ripple of water. It was bright and dazzling, and gave off a sharp feeling when looking at it. The length of the long sword was 3 feet and 6 inches, and it could be considered as a big and sturdy fellow among all the flying swords. Compared to the ordinary flying swords, which were only 3 to 5 inches long and 1 foot long, it was really huge. However, although the flying sword was huge, it was still a lower-grade magical item. It was no different from the few small flying swords in Wu Qi's hands. It was made from an ordinary 100-years-old dark steel mixed with a little bit of dark copper from the bottom of the ocean, and its quality could not be considered as good. As for the formations engraved on its blade, they were the wood element sky sweeping array and the grand white gunmetal iron slashing array, which were the most common lower-grade magical items. Of course, due to the huge size of the sword, there were 12 sky sweeping arrays engraved on its blade, which were 9 more than the ordinary lower-grade magical flying swords, and 6 iron slashing arrays, which were 3 more than the ordinary lower-grade magical flying swords. Therefore, once this flying sword was unleashed, its speed would be 30% faster than the ordinary lower-grade flying swords, and its sharpness would be at least 50% higher. However, such a little improvement in its attributes could not change the fact that this flying sword was just a lower-grade magical item. If Wu Qi's cultivation base was strong enough to produce the Samadhi true flame in his body, he could use his divine sense to carve formations on the flying sword. Then, with the knowledge he obtained from Scroll of Stealing, he could carve 108 higher-grade formations on the body of this huge, flying sword. With that, he could at least forcibly upgrade this flying sword to the level of an upper-grade magical item. Using a mere lower-grade flying sword as a favor? Do you think I've never seen anything good? Narrowing his eyes, Wu Qi tried to recall the vast amount of formations and methods used to craft various magical treasures and spirit items when he inherited the Scroll of Stealing. He could not help but let out a faint sigh. The Samadhi True Flame was an ability that only human immortals could possess. Carefully, Wu Qi raised up the sword edge and gently licked it with the tip of his tongue. After that, he sprayed a mouthful of blood essence onto the sword edge, branding a thread of divine sense into this flying sword named Autumn Water. Then, he performed a profound sword incantation gesture and pointed at the flying sword. A sword cry rang out, and the flying sword soared up into the sky, leaving behind a short cold beam as it flew up into the sky, circling 3 times above Wu Qi's head. For a cultivator of the Meridian cultivating tier, it was considered pretty good that his flying sword could soar into the sky. With the strength of Wu Qi's soul, which was a few times stronger than the others, the fact that the flying sword could fly and pierce through the air within a radius of 200 feet around him showed that it possessed a certain level of combat strength. At first glance, he could be considered as a qualified sword immortal. Behind the Qi circulating technique of 5 elements, there were 3 most basic sword incantations, and the most basic sword techniques of thrusting, spinning, and slashing. However, Wu Qi did not pay any attention to these trivial sword incantations and sword techniques. What he was using now was a sword technique inherited from Scroll of Stealing, which was far more advanced than the sword incantation of Qi circulating technique of 5 elements. After wielding the flying sword for a while, he kept the autumn water sword back into his storage ring. After that, Wu Qi swallowed an innate water pill, and with the power of the pill, he strengthened the innate energy cultivated by the Qi circulating technique of 5 elements by 30%. After that, he closed his eyes and began to snore contentedly. In the pavilion next to the lake, Lu Qingfeng, who was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed, opened his eyes and looked enviously at the cold beam left behind by Wu Qi's flying sword in the sky. He breathed out a faint sigh. Carefully, he took out a few pieces of earth element materials from his storage bag, then slowly burned them with the little 25th lamp. He began to think if he should use his connections to find an immortal sect and join it. However, among all 13 immortal sects of Great Yan Dynasty, which one of them was an expert in the art of formations? Therefore, Lu Qingfeng decided to find out more about them. A few days had passed, and it was the first day of the month. Wu Qi suddenly recalled what Nie Baiheng told him, that he had to go to Mount White Sun and listen to the lecture of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect on the first day of every month. Currently, Lu Qingfeng was carrying out all the tasks in his hands in an orderly manner, and it wouldn't make a difference whether Wu Qi was there or not. Therefore, Wu Qi simply asked for a day's leave from Lu Qingfeng, borrowed a guide from Yan Bugui, and began his journey towards Mount White Sun outside Ji City. The area of several tens of thousands of miles outside Ji City was filled with flatlands and hills, and only a few beautiful mountains could be seen. In this world where mountain ranges stretched for several tens of thousands of miles, these mountains outside Ji City could only be described as small pebbles. They were really inconspicuous. However, as the saying goes, the height of a mountain doesn't matter if it's an immortal. 270 miles to the south of G City, Mount White Sun, the tallest mountain was only 3,000 feet tall, and its circumference was only about 100 miles. It could be considered as one of the famous blessed lands of Great Yen Dynasty. 600 years ago, the founding ancestral master of heaven-breaking sword sect, Nyayaunu, was lucky enough to encounter an immortal's fate in Mount White Sunday. She entered a cave left behind by an immortal, inherited the legacy of that immortal, and founded heaven-breaking sword sect. Although it was founded less than 600 years ago, heaven-breaking sword sect had caught up from behind. Relying on its formidable overall strength, it had firmly occupied the position as the #1 immortal sect among all 13 immortal sects of Great Yen Dynasty. Mount White Sun used to be a place where the rich and idle people of Great Yen Dynasty would go for an outing. But, since Nyayaunu founded Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect here, it had become the headquarters of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect. Today, Mount White Sun was shrouded in a layer of white mist, and a defensive formation had tightly covered the mountain range of 100 miles in circumference. Led by the guide, Wuchi rode on a single-horned deer and came to the front of Mount White Sunday. There was a rugged path paved with stone slabs, and a simple and crude archway made of pure wood. This was the location of the headquarters of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect. Amidst the white mist, 4 young men clad in white robes, their faces filled with arrogance, were seen sitting on a long bench under the archway, their legs crossed and chatting with each other. Because of the barrier of the formation, the voices of these men couldn't be heard. Therefore, Wuchi had no idea what they were talking about. But, by looking at the strange smile on their faces, which any man would understand, Wuchi knew that they were not talking about some pure and innocent business. He coughed and leaped off the mount. Wuchi came before the archway, cupped his fist and bowed to the 4 young men standing several tens of feet away from him through the defensive formation. Fellow disciples, I, Wuchi, offer my greetings. Please do me a favor, as Wuchi is here to listen to the lecture. The few young men were taken aback. Chi-Chi rose to his feet, fixing his eyes on Wuchi. One of them raised a jade medallion and waved it in front of Wuchi. The cloud in front of Wuchi blinked and blinked, opening up a wide path. 4 young men in white robes walked out from the formation, giving Wuchi a scrutinizing glance from top to bottom. After the time it took to finish a pot of tea, the young man who activated the formation sneered at Wuchi and said, "So, you're Wuchi? The hanger-on of Duke Yen Li's mansion, Wuchi? So, you're the one who killed Taba Qingye and wounded Tuoba Haofeng?" Upon hearing this, Wuchi knew that this man did not speak in a friendly tone. He smiled reservedly, nodded his head and said, "Yes, I am Wuchi. However, between Taba Qingye and Tuoba Haofeng, one was killed, and the other was wounded." It was Wuchi who had no other choice. The young man stretched out his hand hastily and stopped Wuchi from continuing. He sneered and said, "Don't bother explaining, we won't listen to you, and you don't have the right to ask us to listen to your explanation. Whether Taba Qingye and Tuoba Haofeng are dead or alive has nothing to do with us." "But, aren't you the one who wounded Haoying Fenglong?" Wuchi was struck dumb again. They knew Haoying Fenglong. The one who wounded Haoying Fenglong was Lu Qingfeng. But, with the friendship between Wuchi and Lu Qingfeng, would it make any difference who wounded Haoying Fenglong? Chuckling, Wuchi nodded his head and said, "The one who wounded Haoying Fenglong is Wuchi. May I ask what advice do you have for me?" The 4 young men in white robes exchanged a glance, then sneered together. Clanging noises of swords rang out, as 4 flying swords flew up into the sky from Chi-Chi. Grinning coldly, the 4 young men said, "If you want to enter the mountain and listen to the lecture, you'll have to defeat us." Not allowing Wuchi to say anything, the 4 flying swords thrust towards him at the same time. Chapter 85. Looking at the 4 sword beams, Wuchi could not help but feel surprised. These 4 young men were so arrogant, and he thought they had some incredible cultivation base. But now, he realized they were nothing special. The sword beams were only a few feet long, and their speed was not even as fast as Wu Qi's movement technique. Let's fight then. After staying in Ji City for so many days, Wu Qi had learned some information about the 13 immortal sects of Great Yan Dynasty. When the disciples fought among themselves, not only would they not be punished by the sect rules, they would also be strongly supported by the seniors of the sect. As long as they didn't use poison or sneak attack from behind, even if they killed their fellow disciples in a head-on fight, the sect would not punish them. Sneering, Wu Qi didn't care about the background of these few fellows. With a sway of his body, he dodged the 4 sword beams and quickly came before the 4 young men. A series of thunder-like kicks were unleashed, and one of the young men had his lower body kicked by Wu Qi. Among these 4 young men, one of them had the cultivation base of respiration of Xiantian realm, while the other 3 were peak-stage Hotian realm cultivators. But, no matter what cultivation base they had, the most vulnerable part of a man was still the most lethal part. With just one kick from Wu Qi, the 4 young men were sent flying 30 feet away. But, as they possessed a pretty good movement skill, they managed to land on the ground steadily. Strangely, they covered their lower bodies with both hands, spread their legs apart as if they were standing in a horse stance. Hissing sounds could be heard coming from their mouths as they stared at Wu Qi with a very strange look. Slowly, their eyeballs bulged out from their eye sockets. The sword beams that failed to hit Wu Qi were hovering above his head in a sluggish manner, not moving at all. Without hesitation, Wu Qi grabbed all 4 lower-grade flying swords and shoved them into his storage ring. He looked sympathetically at the 4 young men, whose faces were slowly turning pale. With a soft voice, he said, "If it hurts, just scream it out. I've kicked that part of your body, I know it hurts. We're all from the same sect, so I won't laugh at you. If you want to scream, just scream it out." A high-pitched scream rose into the sky. The 4 white-robed young men covered their nether regions and rolled on the ground. Their faces suddenly turned purplish red, and cold sweat appeared all over their bodies. Leisurely, Wu Qi walked past them, walking along the stone path and heading up the mountain. Just now, he had a sense of propriety. The lower bodies of the 4 people would at most be swollen for a few days. There wouldn't be any sequelae. At most, they would feel a lot of pain now. After giving a few instructions to the guide, asking him to wait for him outside the mountain gate, Wu Qi walked along the path up the mountain for more than 1,000 feet. Suddenly, he looked at a big rock on the side of the road and laughed. "Hey, you've been looking for a long time, haven't you?" Just now, when he kicked those 4 youths, he heard someone take a deep breath on this big rock, so he knew that someone was hiding here. A green light flashed, and a young man in a white robe emerged from the green light. He looked at Wu Qi in surprise, then looked at the green jade invisibility talisman in his hand that was carved in the shape of a leaf, and frowned deeply. With a cold snort, the young man jumped off the big rock and took out a small booklet with a golden silk cover from his sleeve. Using a thin pen, he quickly wrote a few lines of words on it. "You guys can't even handle a new disciple who hasn't even officially joined the sect, and you guys have learned so many tricks of heaven-breaking swordsmanship sect. All 4 of you will be demoted from 2nd-class disciple to 3rd-class disciple. After your duty today, go to the punishment hall and report to the elders yourselves." Yelling at the 4 young men who were twitching on the ground, the white-robed young man raised his chin and glanced at Wu Qi out of the corner of his eye. "You're Wu Qi, the new disciple of the sect leader. You're pretty good. All the new disciples are 3rd-class disciples, but since you've defeated 4 2nd-class disciples, your status will be promoted to 2nd-class disciple today." He took out another booklet from his sleeve and threw it over to Wu Qi. With a cold voice, the white-robed young man said, "I'm Haoying Fengying, the elder brother of Haoying Fenglong. For the past 3 months, I've been in charge of investigating and recording every single word and action of heaven-breaking swordsmanship sect's disciples. These are the rules of our sect, and all the things that you need to pay attention to. Memorize them first, and don't break any rules. If that happens, no one can save you. Hao Ying Fengying snorted a cold breath from his nostrils, gave Wu Qi a disdainful glance, then turned around and was about to leave. Wu Qi hastily caught up to Hao Ying Fengying, grabbed his sleeve. Hao Ying Fengying's face darkened. He turned around, stared at Wu Qi, and snapped, "Wu Qi, what are you trying to do?" Clang! The sword hanging on Hao Ying Fengying's waist suddenly leaped out from the sword case. It was about 1 foot long, glowing with a dark green light and emanating a cold air. It was a mid-tier magical item, a flying sword. Hao Ying Fengying's cultivation base was quite mature, having reached the physique-strengthening tier of innate realm. A powerful innate energy surged into the flying sword, and suddenly, a few inches thick sword beam burst out from the flying sword. Wu Qi threw a glance at the flying sword that emitted a cold air, then smiled. He pulled Hao Ying Fengying's arm and asked, "Are you Hao Ying Fenglong's elder brother?" Hao Ying Fengying answered with a cold voice, "Yes, I am." "What are you going to do?" Wu Qi smiled again. Since Lu Qingfeng had slapped Hao Ying Fenglong on the pleasure boat, he had learned about the current situation of Hao Ying clan through Yan Bugui. It was true that Hao Ying Fenglong was Hao Ying Fenglong's elder brother, but he was just the son of a concubine. Thus, it was impossible for him to inherit the power and position of Hao Ying clan. The best result would be that he could own a small piece of land in Hao Ying clan's territory, and live a carefree life for the rest of his life. With a bright smile on his face, Wu Qi grabbed Hao Ying Fengying's wrist. Hao Ying Fengying was startled. The sword hanging on his waist flew out from the sword case with a loud clang, leaving an 8 feet long green beam in the air, and was about to thrust towards Wu Qi. Hastily, Wu Qi shouted, "Don't be hasty, listen to me. You help me gain a foothold in heaven-breaking sword sect, and I'll help you deal with Hao Ying Fenglong. Those who are not the legitimate eldest son are not allowed to inherit the clan's property. But, there are always exceptions, don't you think?" The sword beam returned to the sword case. Hao Ying Fengying gazed at Wu Qi coldly for a while, sneered and said, "What can you help me with?" Wu Qi said without hesitation, "However much you can help me, my young master, and I can help you. I know nothing about heaven-breaking sword sect, and it is not easy for me to gain a foothold here. As for you, based on your birth mother's background, don't tell me you want to be a wealthy man for the rest of your life?" After a brief moment of silence, Hao Ying Fengying laughed as well. He held Wu Qi's hand, lowered his voice and said, "It's worth it for me to exchange my position with senior brother and come here to wait for you. I thought you wouldn't come back today, but I didn't expect that you would really come. Deal." Wu Qi squeezed Hao Ying Fengying's hand, smiled and said, "You've been waiting for me here. We're both smart men, so let's cut to the chase. You help me, and I'll help you. In the future, in G City, not only me, my young master will have to rely on many friends as well." Both men smiled at each other. Without saying anything, they had already made up their minds. Hand in hand, both men walked along the stone path towards the depth of Mount White Sunday. Along the way, Hao Ying Fengying told Wu Qi about the situation of heaven-breaking sword sect in detail, and these were the information that Wu Qi urgently needed. After all, even in the secret archives of Scouting Office, there was no detailed information about the 13 immortal sects of Great Yan Dynasty. Even if there was, it was not something that Yan Bugui could easily access, as it was a top secret of Great Yan Dynasty's strategic level. According to Hao Ying Fengying's introduction, the two people with the greatest power in heaven-breaking sword sect today were the Grand Elders, Nia Yaonu, and Yan Li. Nia Yaonu was the founding ancestral master of heaven-breaking sword sect, and also the birth mother of the current sect leader, Nia Baihong. 100 years ago, after she handed over the position of sect leader to Nia Baihong, she had been living in seclusion and cultivating in the back of the mountain. 100 years ago, Nia Yaonu had broken through the peak of Jin Dan realm. As for Yan Li, he was the lineal grandson of Emperor Yan Dan, the third son of Yan Qijuan, the crown prince of Yan Yan. 2 months after Nia Yaonu accidentally discovered the immortal's cave left behind by an immortal in Mount White Sun, he married Nia Yaonu. It was said that the relationship between the couple was not very good. Apart from Nyeyaonu, his first wife, Yenli had no less than 200 concubines and concubines. Nyeyaonu was the founding ancestral master of heaven-breaking sword sect, the spiritual leader of the sect. On the other hand, Yenli, as well as many elders who were close to him, were the men with the real power in heaven-breaking sword sect. There were a total of 36 elders in heaven-breaking sword sect's elder council, and all of them were human immortals who had cultivated the Jin Dan realm. Among them, 27 were elders who were close to Yenli. These 27 elders all came from the imperial clan of Great Yen Dynasty, Jing clan, Qin clan, Gao clan, and other influential clans. As for the current sect leader, Nia Baihong, it seemed to be a taboo topic. Haoying Fengying opened his mouth, but no words came out. Then, he changed the topic and began to introduce some other things that happened in heaven-breaking sword sect. For example, the disciples of heaven-breaking sword sect, like Wu Qi, who just joined the sect, were all third-class disciples. Unless they contributed some meritorious service to heaven-breaking sword sect, or defeated some higher-ranked disciples, they would never be able to get a promotion. Therefore, they could only cultivate the basic energy cultivating technique of heaven-breaking sword sect, the qi circulating technique of 5 elements. Only after they broke through the first class from the third class, second class, and finally became an inner sect disciple of heaven-breaking sword sect, could they have access to the cultivation scriptures of heaven-breaking sword sect. And only the core disciples among the inner sect disciples could inherit the most orthodox sword technique of heaven-breaking sword sect. For example, Nia Baihong alone had 3,000 disciples. Among them, there were less than 300 second-class disciples, over 70 first-class disciples, 13 inner sect disciples, and none of the core disciples. These 3,000 disciples were all the more important disciples from the influential clans of Great Yen Dynasty. Those disciples like Wu Qi who did not come from an influential clan could be counted with 2 hands. Basically, it was the same situation in all 13 immortal sects of Great Yen Dynasty. The members of the imperial clan with the surname of Yen held most of the real power, and their disciples were all from the wealthy and influential clans of Great Yen Dynasty. Unless an ordinary citizen had a heaven-defying talent, he or she would never be accepted as a disciple. Even if there were some heaven-defying geniuses among the ordinary citizens, it was unknown if he or she could survive until the day he or she finished his apprenticeship. At least, in the 20 years since Haoying Fengying joined the sect, he had witnessed with his own eyes the accidental death of several hundred so-called geniuses who came from ordinary families. Listening to Haoying Fengying's description of the situation in the sect, Wu Qi felt his heart tighten again. It seemed like every step he took in heaven-breaking sword sect was filled with trepidation, and he had to be extra careful. While talking, both of them walked at a brisk pace for nearly an hour. Finally, they arrived at the base of heaven-breaking sword sect, which was located at the core of Mount White Sunday surrounded by mountains. There was a basin with a diameter of tens of miles. A couple dozens of palaces of different sizes were erected in this basin. This was the base of heaven-breaking sword sect. Haoying Fengying grabbed Wu Qi, pulled him and ran towards the nearest palaces. There was still some time before today's lecture. The sect's elders would only appear at noon to give a lecture. The most important thing now was to help Wu Qi go through all the procedures required for a new disciple. First of all, he had to test Wu Qi's route of cultivation. Chapter 86. The palace where heaven-breaking sword sect tested the bone structure of new disciples was called the Heaven's Will Palace. It meant that the foundation of all cultivators was the predestined Heaven's Will. The Heaven's Will could never be defied. If the Heaven's Will determined that one could become an immortal, then one could do it. If the Heaven's Will determined that one did not have the qualification to become an immortal, then one could only play with mud in the mortal world. Because of this, the overall atmosphere of the Heaven's Will Palace was very oppressive and heavy. The pitch-black palace was entirely built using mountain rocks with a very high content of iron, and the words written on the plaque hanging in front of the door were gray and without any luster. It was as if the Heaven's Will Palace was pressing heavily on one's body, something that could never be defied, changed, or transcended. One could only endure it passively. Haoying Fengying kept explaining to Wu Qi. Not only the Heavens Will Palace of Heaven-Breaking Sword sect had the same design, the palaces used by all 13 immortal sects of Great Yen Dynasty to test the bone structure and innate talent of the new disciples had the same design. It was as if Great Yen Dynasty was purposely declaring something, and the meaning behind it could only be comprehended by oneself, and no one could tell it to them. Wu Qi walked along the path paved with black stones for a long distance, and finally arrived at the palace where the Heavens Will Palace tested the bone structure of new disciples. The palace was very deep and wide, measuring over 1,000 feet in both length and width, but only less than 20 feet in height. Even when standing outside the palace, it gave off a very heavy oppressive feeling. But when they entered the palace, the oppressive feeling was at least 100 times stronger. The four walls of such a wide and low hall were pitch black, and the ceiling and floor were as black as ink. Yet, there were only 6 candlesticks placed in the middle of the palace, and a few large butter candles were lit sparsely on top of them. The light in the palace was very dim. A few old men were sitting on cushions at the far end of the palace, chatting idly. They looked like ghosts in the dim palace. Haoying Fengying brought Wu Qi to the far end of the palace, bowed respectfully at the few old men. The aura emanating from these few old men was very obscure, and their skin was extremely shriveled and withered. It was as if their grayish skin would turn into ashes with just a little poke of a finger. All of them were at the embryonic breath tier of Xiantian realm, and all of their spirit, qi, and spirit were gathered inside their bodies. They were all peak-level Xiantian realm martial artists. Among them, there was an old man with a sharp life force faintly discernible in his body. He was a top-notch expert who had 1 foot in the Jin Dan realm. As long as he could take this step, he would transform from a Xiantian Daoist to a human immortal, which would increase his lifespan by at least 800 years. 1 step mortal, 1 step immortal. Among the 5 old men who were chatting idly, this old man's status was clearly the most important. The other 4 old men seemed to regard him as their leader. When the old man saw Haoying Fengying, he let out a dry laugh and said, "Oh, it's you, Fengying. Aren't you in charge of patrolling the mountain today? Why did he come to the Heavens Will Palace? Who was this kid? A new disciple? I haven't heard that the elders have accepted any new disciples." Haoying Fengying laughed. He turned to the old man and said, "Third grand uncle, you may not know this, but this is Wu Qi, the sect leader has just accepted him as a disciple a few days ago." It was Princess Zhanglu who personally sent someone to greet the sect leader. Princess Zhanglu said that if the sect leader refused to accept Wu Qi as his disciple, she would cut off the supply of energy stones and swords for this year. Therefore, the sect leader personally came to accept him as a disciple. "Oh," answered Chi-Chi, and curiously looked at Wu Qi. Haoying Fengying's third grand-uncle, Haoying Xiong, nodded his head in surprise and said, "So, it was Princess Zhanglu who gave the order. I can't believe she would actually do something like this. Didn't Bai Xiaoguan offend her 3 years ago?" As a result, all the energy stones and magical items that Bai Xiaoguan should have received for that year were thrown from the upper reaches of Myriad Red River to the lower reaches by Princess Zhanglu. The few old men laughed at Chi-Chi. Haoying Xiong waved his hand at Wu Qi, smiled and said, "Since he is the new disciple of the sect leader, it doesn't matter if he has a bone frame or not. But, since he has come to Heaven's Will Palace, it is a good thing for him to have a better understanding of his own bone frame." Haoying Xiong smacked his lips, smiled and said, "If he really has the bone frame of cultivating immortality, he should put in more effort. Perhaps, he can form the Jin Dan and exchange it for a few hundred years of freedom. But, if he doesn't have the bone frame of cultivating immortality, since he is still the disciple of the sect leader, no one will drive him out. Borrowing the name of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect, you can bully the men and women in Ji City for over 100 years. That is quite a pleasant thing." Cold sweat broke out on Wu Qi's forehead when he heard what Haoying Xiong said. Sure enough, Haoying Xiong was straightforward with his words, without any hypocrisy. He was right. There were 3,000 disciples under Nye Baihong, and not every one of them was a talented cultivator. At least half of them didn't have the talent of cultivating Tao. Nevertheless, these 3,000 disciples were still the disciples of heaven-breaking sword sect, just like Haoying Fenglong. He didn't even have a strong cultivation base, but it didn't stop him from becoming the disciple of heaven-breaking sword sect, and continued to be the first successor of Haoying clan. Haoying Xiong and the few old men continued to talk nonsense for a while. Suddenly, they recalled the purpose of Wu Qi's visit. Haoying Xiong pressed a few times on the ground. A few thick and heavy tiles on the ground slowly moved away, and a stone platform slowly rose up from the ground. On top of the square platform stood a white crystal pillar, about 10 feet tall and as thick as a water bucket. Wu Qi recognized it. It was the Yuan Ling crystal, mentioned in Scroll of Stealing, which was specially used to test the bone structure and talent of a cultivator. Without saying anything, Wu Qi stepped onto the stone platform, placed his right hand on the Yuan Ling crystal, and injected a stream of innate energy into it. A watery gleam flickered on the surface of the Yuan Ling crystal, and a pale blue gleam emerged. Haoying Xiong nodded his head slowly and said, it's a spirit seed, that's not bad. No matter how far the spirit seed can develop in the future, it's better than nothing. Furthermore, it's a water spirit seed, so I can cultivate the sword technique of the azure water sword. But, if it's a earth or fire spirit seed, it would be troublesome. Shakily, Haoying Xiong rose to his feet and walked onto the stone platform. He performed an incantation gesture and cast a hand incantation on the Yuan Ling crystal. A large sheet of nearly transparent white gleam surged out from the Yuan Ling crystal, enveloping Wu Qi within it. Wu Qi felt that all his blood and qi were flowing at an incredible speed under the stimulation of the white gleam, and all his energy essence was rushing towards his spiritual ocean without his control, forcefully crashing into a mysterious place in his spiritual ocean. A faint cry rang out. A ray of light burst out from between Wu Qi's brows, and an indistinct shadow gradually emerged. Haoying Xiong took out a ruler from his sleeve, pointing it at the shadow and measuring it. After that, he nodded his head smilingly and praised, "Innate nascent embryo is 5 feet tall, wonderful. This is an upper-tier innate nascent embryo." With a thought in Wu Qi's mind, all the information about innate nascent embryo that he found in Scroll of Stealing quickly emerged in his mind. Innate nascent embryo had nothing to do with Taoists of Xiantian realm or human immortals of Jin Dan realm. However, after cultivating into the nascent soul realm, the so-called Earth Immortals of nascent soul realm, their achievement would have a great relationship with the innate nascent embryo. The innate nascent embryo would decide the highest achievement an Earth Immortal could achieve, because the highest height a nascent soul could achieve was directly related to the height of the innate nascent embryo. When an innate nascent embryo was 3 feet tall, the strongest nascent soul would be 3 feet tall. When an innate nascent embryo was 6 feet tall, the strongest nascent soul would be 6 feet tall. When a nascent soul was 1 inch tall, its energy would be 3 times stronger, depending on the level of the cultivation technique it was cultivating. If the energy of a 1-inch nascent soul was divided into 1, the energy of a 3 feet nascent soul would be 90, and a 6 feet nascent soul would be 180. Generally speaking, the tallest innate nascent embryo of an ordinary cultivator was 6 feet tall. 1 foot was lower grade, 2 feet was lower grade, 3 feet was lower grade, 4 feet was middle grade, 5 feet was upper grade, and 6 feet was upper grade. As for those whose nascent embryo was over 6 feet tall, they were destined to be gold immortals. Wu Qi's innate nascent embryo was 5 feet tall. Among all the cultivators, this was a rare and excellent potential. If he could cultivate into the nascent soul realm, his achievement was destined to be greater than the others. Wu Qi smiled faintly. He did not put the matter of innate nascent embryo in his heart. For those who were cultivating the Scroll of Stealing, the innate nascent embryo was definitely not the deciding factor that would restrict their future achievement. Even if his innate nascent embryo was only 3 inches tall, it would not affect him at all. There was nothing under the heaven that could not be stolen, and this innate nascent embryo was also something that could be stolen from the scroll of stealing. As long as he could steal a thread of innate fortune energy from someone, Wuqi's innate nascent embryo could keep growing and growing stronger. Not to mention 6 feet tall, it was even possible for him to have a nascent embryo that was 6,000 feet tall. When Haoying Xiong saw the disapproving expression on Wuqi's face, he thought Wuqi did not know the importance of innate nascent embryo. Therefore, he quickly explained the pros and cons to him. In the end, Haoying Xiong even told Wuqi with mixed emotions that his innate nascent embryo was only 3 feet and 6 inches tall, which was considered as a middle grade. If one day, he could cultivate into the nascent soul realm, his future achievement would be unpredictable. At least, when facing the heavenly tribulation, the stronger the nascent soul was, the more confident he would be in transcending the heavenly tribulation. The last test was when Haoying Xiong took out a thumb-sized lower-grade water elemental energy stone, which was polished into a square shape. The amount of energy contained within this energy stone was fixed. Haoying Xiong wanted Wuqi to absorb the energy within 1 hour with all his might. Exercising the technique of Qi's circulating technique of 5 elements, Wuqi held the energy stone in his palm and slowly absorbed the faint energy contained within it. The technique of Qi's circulating technique of 5 elements was not a good cultivation technique. In just 1 hour, Wuqi had only absorbed 30 portions of energy from the energy stone, and only 9 portions of energy remained in his meridians and transformed into innate energy of 5 elements. In other words, Wuqi could only retain 30% of energy. When he absorbed 100 portions of energy from the outside world, he would be able to transform 30% of it into innate energy. Faced with this result, Wuqi felt that the technique of Qi's circulating technique of 5 elements was the trashiest cultivation technique, while Haoying Xiong and the others kept nodding their heads in satisfaction. To retain 30% of energy could be considered as a pretty good cultivation talent. Among the 3,000 apprentices under Nie Baihong, some of them who possessed spirit seeds could not even retain 20% of their energy. All in all, Haoying Xiong and the other 4 apprentices gave their evaluation of Wuqi's bone structure and talent. With a spirit seed, one could cultivate the Tao. With a water elemental spirit seed, one could cultivate the sword technique of the Azure Water Sword in Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect. With a 5 feet tall nascent embryo, an excellent talent, and a 30% retention of energy, he could already be considered as an excellent apprentice. All in all, according to Haoying Xiong, Wuqi was an excellent talent that was suitable to develop in Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect. As long as he did not make any mistakes, he would be able to form the Jin Dan in the future. At such a young age, he had already reached the realm of Xiantian, so it was possible for him to form the Jin Dan within 100 years. Before Haoying Xiong could finish his words, a loud laughter was heard coming from the entrance of the Grand Hall. I can't believe there is such a beautiful talent here. Who is your master? Why don't you become my apprentice? Along with the laughter, an old man clad in a black robe strode into the hall. Chapter 87. Ear-piercing slicing sounds rang out incessantly, causing the empty hall to reverberate with waves of reverberations. Behind the old man who walked into the hall, there were 6 dark swords spinning slowly, forming a harmonious and flawless wheel of swords. Invisible sword intents burst out from the swords, slashing across the pitch-black floor of the hall and producing a large amount of sparks. Wherever the old man passed, sparks would fly in all directions, and the jarring noises would make one's eardrums hurt and their brains roll. Just like Nie Baihong, this old man was also a human immortal of Jin Dan realm, and a very strong one at that. The 6 sword shadows behind him were not real swords, but the strange signs of the overflowing and condensing of core qi in his body. Just like how Nie Baihong left footprints on the surface of the river, they were the signs of a human immortal activating the power of the great Tao of heaven and earth and manifesting them. However, compared to the strange sign formed by Nie Baihong, the 6 swords behind the old man were undoubtedly more aggressive and aggressive. If not because the floor of Heaven's Will Palace was protected by a formation, the old man would have destroyed at least half of Heaven's Will Palace along the way. Upon seeing this old man, Hao Yingxiong and the others quickly rose to their feet and bowed, addressing him as Elder Qin. Hao Yingfeng quickly bowed to the old man as well, then secretly transmitted his voice to Wu Qi, Qin Shuwen, the elder of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect's Punishment Hall, the youngest brother of the current clan leader of Qin clan of Great Yan Dynasty, the grand-uncle of Scouting Office's Central Wind Guard, Qin Qingshui. His main cultivation technique is the Raging Thunder Sword of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect. Quickly bow to him, quickly bow to him. Hao Yingfeng dared not to raise his head, but condensed his voice into a thin thread and transmitted it into Wu Qi's ears. Qin Qingshui's grand-uncle. Wu Qi suddenly recalled the long donkey-like face of Qin Qingshui, and on the day when Lu Qingfeng was assassinated, Qin Qingshui actually wanted to arrest Lu Qingfeng and interrogate him. Qin Qingshui was definitely not Wu Qi's friend, so it was obvious that his granduncle would not fall in love with Wu Qi at first sight. Bowing deeply, Wu Qi turned to Qin Shuwen, smiled and said, "Wu Qi offers greeting, Elder Qin." The so-called beautiful talent was really an overpraise. Wu Qi is just an ordinary warrior. He only joined the heaven-splitting swordsmanship sect for a 1 in a million chance. I don't deserve to be called an elder. Qin Shuwen walked slowly and came before Wu Qi. Suddenly, he pressed his palm onto Wu Qi's shoulder. He laughed out loud and said, "You deserve it, you deserve it. I've been listening outside the main hall for a long time." A 5 feet long nascent embryo, and 30% of its spiritual energy is a top-notch cultivation aptitude. I specialize in Berserk Lightning, which is a variant of the metal element sword technique. You are a water element spiritual seed. Metal begets water, so I can teach you. When he pressed his palm down, an invisible force of thunder rushed into Wu Qi's body, attacking his entire body through his meridians. With Wu Qi's cultivation base, the force of thunder could not harm his life, but it was more than enough to injure his meridians, and even hurt his cultivation foundation. If not handled properly, the force of thunder could even shatter all his meridians, and it might even ruin his future of cultivation. Wu Qi was startled, and hastily took a step back. However, Qin Shuwen followed closely like a shadow. He didn't move at all, but his right palm was pressed tightly on Wu Qi's shoulder, following closely behind Wu Qi for a few steps, never leaving Wu Qi's side. Qin Shuwen let out a long laugh and said, "Good boy, Wu Qi, it's your good fortune that I've taken a fancy to you. Now, kneel down and kowtow to me, and you'll be my disciple from now on." The force of Qin Shuwen's palm had increased by a few notches. All the muscles on Wu Qi's body were trembling violently. The force of thunder was crazily surging in his meridians, stimulating all his internal organs and making them vibrate at a very high frequency. The powerful electric currents kept flowing inside his body. Wu Qi's body was twitching and shivering, and the short hair on his head stood up. Suddenly, a few dazzling sparks burst out from the ends of his hair. Hao Yingxiong and the others looked at Wu Qi, who was being pressed down by Qin Shuwen's palm. They kept quiet out of fear, not daring to make any sound. A mighty Jin Dan realm human immortal had struck out and killed a new disciple. Even if he was backed by a duke like Lu Qingfeng, who would dare to say a word? He was just a rookie duke who had just inherited the title of nobility. If it were someone like Yu Xian, he might still be able to make people fear him, but the weight of Lu Qingfeng was far from that. A bright gleam shone from Qin Shuwen's eyes. He stared fixedly at Wu Qi, whose body was shivering uncontrollably. With a faint smile on his face, he said, "Aren't you going to kowtow to me? Acknowledging me as your master will bring you a lot of benefits." The Sword of Raging Thunder is the fiercest and sharpest sword technique in Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect. I don't care what level of disciple you are, I'll teach you the essence of the Sword of Raging Thunder. Isn't that good? Wu Qi's body turned stiff, trembling violently under Qin Shuwen's palm. His nerves were nearly separated from his body. Even though he was roaring crazily in his mind to take over his body, he still couldn't move even a finger. He stared at Qin Shuwen with his eyes wide open. His eyeballs were popping out from his eye sockets bit by bit, nearly bursting out from his eye sockets by the powerful force of thunder. Kneel down, kowtow, perform the ritual of acknowledging me as your master. Are you still not willing to do that? An unhappy expression emerged on Qin Shuwen's face. He sneered and said, "Are you saying that I'm not qualified to be your master? Do you really think that I'm not qualified to teach you? Humph. Don't think that you will have a great achievement in the future just because you have some innate talent. In my eyes, you are no different than an ant." Wu Qi opened his mouth, wanting to let out some curses. However, as the muscles around his vocal cords were paralyzed by the electric current, how could he make any sound? He fixed his gaze on Qin Shuwen, and could only let out a weak sound of air flow from his throat. Gradually, blood began to flow out from his 7 apertures. The crimson blood looked particularly dazzling against his fair skin. Hao Yingxiong and the others were still standing at the side, remaining silent. They dared not to make any noise. They bowed their heads, not even daring to look at Wu Qi's current appearance. Even Hao Yingfengying, who had formed an alliance with Wu Qi, could only lower his head and stare quietly at the tip of his own feet. The so-called alliance, the so-called code of brotherhood, under the pressure of a human immortal of Jin Dan realm, they were nothing but bullshit. Qin Shuwen was laughing, a very happy laugh. Wave after wave of thunder force kept bursting out from his palm, smashing into Wu Qi's body. While laughing, he scolded, "You're really not giving me any face. I've personally taken you as my disciple, but you didn't even say a word, and showed no reaction at all. Wu Qi, oh Wu Qi, what can I say about you? Who are you relying on? You actually dare to not put this elder in your eyes?" Crack. Qin Shuwen clenched his fingers together, and in an instant, a dozen cracks appeared on Wu Qi's left shoulder blade. The severe pain made Wu Qi's vision blacked out, and the circulation of innate energy in his 12 standard meridians and 8 extraordinary meridians stopped immediately. The few meridians near his left shoulder were clogged up, and the meridians there were like the intestines of a chicken that had been forcefully inflated. Gradually, they began to swell up, making Wu Qi's shoulder swell up. Staring straight into Qin Shuwen's face, Wu Qi swore in his mind that no matter what background Qin Shuwen and Qin Qingshui had, no matter what kind of rich and powerful clan the Qin clan behind them was, he swore that he would wipe out every last member of the Qin clan. Twice, this was the second time that the Qin clan had tried to kill him without any reason. The first time was Qin Qingshui, but it was a pity that he failed. But this time, it was a human immortal of Jin Dan realm who personally struck. The innate water energy was flowing slowly in the water meridians in both his arms, constantly devouring and absorbing the thunder force that blasted into his body. Among the 5 elements, gold gave birth to water. Qin Shuwen's Raging Thunder Sword technique was a variation of the Gold Element Sword technique. The thunder force unleashed by him was filled with the energy of Gold Element. Bit by bit, the innate water energy was absorbing the thunder force, transforming it into his own cultivation base. With the water meridians as the center, the blood in Wu Qi's body formed into 2 huge whirlpools, transforming and absorbing the thunder force that gushed into his body and storing them into the water meridians. This was a cultivation technique that was completely different from the orthodox cultivation technique. Even though Qin Shuwen had formed the Jin Dan realm and possessed the body of an immortal, he still couldn't sense the subtle transformation happening in Wu Qi's body. Scroll of stealing, no matter it was a great thief or a petty thief, all of them had the ability to conceal their aura. If they were easily discovered by others, how could they steal the profound meaning of the heaven and earth? It was because Wu Qi's body was slowly transforming the thunder force that blasted into his body that Wu Qi was able to hold on until now without being killed by the thunder force. If it were any other cultivator of Xiantian realm, after being struck by such a heavy attack by Qin Shuwen, his internal organs would have long been burned into ashes by the thunder force. You don't want to acknowledge me as your master. You really don't want to. You don't want to learn the profound meaning of the Raging Thunder Sword technique? Like a cat toying with a mouse, Qin Shuwen revealed a mocking smile. He liked to see people struggling in a desperate situation, and he liked to see the look of despair and helplessness on their faces. The fact that Wu Qi was able to hold on for so long under his thunder force had filled him with an abnormal pleasure. The longer he could hold on, the better it would be. He liked to toy someone to death slowly. It looks like you really don't want to give me any face. Who are you relying on? Qin Shuwen burst into a loud laughter. Haoying Fengying, who had been standing aside without saying a word for a long time, suddenly mustered his courage. He raised his head up carefully, lowered his voice and said, "Elder Qin, Wu Qi is the man personally ordered by Princess Zhangluo." Qin Shuwen turned his head back angrily. His eyes focused, and an invisible sword intent knocked Haoying Fengying several hundred feet away. The fierce sword intent sliced open Haoying Fengying's body, bringing up tens of long streams of blood. Qin Shuwen roared furiously, "Who do you think you are? How dare you interrupt me? You are just a dog with no manners." Although Qin Shuwen's words were harsh to the ears, it had also scolded Haoying Xiong. Haoying Xiong's face turned blue with anger. If Haoying Fengying was a dog, then didn't that mean all the members of his Haoying clan were dogs? Although Haoying clan was a clan that had risen in the recent few hundred years, there were still people in their clan who were ranked among the 9 ministers. They were one of the most prestigious clans in Great Yan Dynasty. Haoying Xiong raised his head and glared at Qin Shuwen, then strode towards Haoying Fengying. He took out a healing pill and gave it to Haoying Fengying to stop the bleeding. While working, Haoying Xiong said with a deep voice, "Elder Qin, I'll report what you said just now to the elders in my clan." Qin Shuwen glared at him, sneered and said, "Oh? Then you can lie down with me." Qin Shuwen retracted his right palm, then performed a sword incantation and was about to point his finger at Haoying Xiong. Qin Shuwen had never expected that right after he retracted his right palm, Wu Qi would use the quickest speed, even at the cost of his own blood essence, to forcefully devour all the thunder force in his body using a mystic technique learned in Scroll of Stealing. Without the replenishment from the external thunder force, once the thunder force was absorbed by his body, he immediately regained his ability to move. He glared at Qin Shuwen furiously, then pulled out a thick stack of explosive talismans from his storage ring. These talismans were the defensive items that Wu Qi had bought from Yan Bugui with a hefty sum of money during the past few days. Ji City was a dangerous place. Following Wu Wang's instinct of arming himself to the teeth, after Lu Qingfeng inherited the title of duke, Wu Qi had immediately used all the gold, silver, and jewelry he found in Little Meng City to purchase a total of 200 explosive talismans. Now, he had taken out all 200 explosive talismans. With the quickest speed possible, he shoved all 200 explosive talismans into Qin Shuwen's belt. After that, Wu Qi circulated all his innate water energy and exercised the escape art of innate water. In just a blink of an eye, he had fled several hundred feet away. After that, Wu Qi performed a hand incantation and shouted out loud, "Explode!" A miserable howl and a loud boom echoed out. Heaven's Will Palace was instantly enveloped by a raging flame. 200 explosive talismans controlled by Wu Qi using his divine sense exploded at the same time. Chapter 88. The flame spread in all directions, and a threatening heat wave blanketed the entire Heaven's Will Palace. Haoying Xiong, Haoying Fengying, and a few other men were pushed far away by the airflow. Their bodies were pressed tightly against the wall of Heaven's Will Palace, unable to move even a little bit. The tremendous pressure made blood burst out from their 7 apertures, and all their internal organs were severely injured. Especially for the 4 old men who were sitting on the cushions just now. God knew how many of their bones were broken by the explosion, and they had fainted while coughing out blood. However, the one who suffered the most was Qin Shuwen. As a middle-stage human immortal of Gold Core Realm, Qin Shuwen had never thought that Wu Qi could actually attack him, and that Wu Qi really had the courage to attack him, and that Wu Qi really possessed something that could hurt him. Explosive talismans, especially those used by the secret agents of Scouting Office, were the best of the best. They were crafted by the Heavenly Spirit sect, the sect that was the best in crafting talismans in Great Yen Dynasty. The power of each explosive talisman was roughly equal to the power of a highly explosive grenade. When 200 explosive talismans were stacked together and detonated, the destructive power would be far greater than 200 highly explosive grenades. Qin Shuwen didn't use his energy to protect his body, and he didn't have the time to take out any defensive magical treasure. With his cultivation base, it was impossible for him to own a spirit item that could protect its owner on its own. Therefore, he had suffered the explosive power of 200 explosive talismans at a close distance. His clothes were torn to shreds, and his body was badly mutilated from the explosion, from his chest to his knees. It was a horrible sight to behold. Especially the area near his dantian, the vital spot where the Jin Dan realm human immortal Jin Dan resided. Qin Shuwen's abdomen was nearly pierced through by the explosion. A large amount of pale golden airflow kept bursting out from the bowl-sized hole on his abdomen. The destructive power of the explosive talisman had wounded his Jin Dan, and caused cracks to appear on his Jin Dan. Jin Dan was the most fundamental thing for a human immortal, and it was the seed that they used to develop their nascent soul. When a human immortal successfully cultivated the Jin Dan, he would have a lifespan of 800 years, but when he cultivated his nascent soul, he would have a lifespan of at least 3,000 years. If Jin Dan was damaged, not only would his cultivation level fall a lot, but it might also affect his future nascent soul cultivation. Qin Shuwen, who was severely wounded by the explosion, sat on the ground with a blank expression. He stared blankly at the huge wound on his lower abdomen, sensing the messy and broken meridians near his dantian. He threw his head back and let out a miserable howl that shook the heaven and earth. His Jin Dan was damaged. Along with the pale golden airflow gushing out from his body, Qin Shuwen could clearly sense that his cultivation base was fading away bit by bit, and the connection between his divine will and Jin Dan was weakening as well. If not for the fact that a human immortal of Jin Dan realm had the body of an immortal, which was at least 10 times stronger than an ordinary mortal, a warrior of Hotian realm, or a Daoist of Xiantian realm, Qin Shuwen would have long exploded into pieces. Although the 200 explosive talismans meticulously crafted by Heavenly Spirit sect were of the lowest grade among all fire element talismans, when Qin Shuwen imagined the scene of 200 explosive talismans exploding at the same time, he could not help but feel a chill running down his spine. The floor of Heaven's Will Palace was crafted using mountain rocks with a high content of iron, and was protected by all kinds of defensive formations. A hole of about 10 feet in diameter was created by the explosion. Wisps of dark smoke kept gushing out from the hole, and tiny pieces of dark flesh and sticky blood could be seen everywhere. 99% of these things came from Qin Shuwen's body. Qin Shuwen covered his dantian tightly with both hands, exerting his cultivation to stop the energy of Jin Dan from leaking out. He murmured to himself, "I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you. Wu Qi, you've ruined Qingshui's plan, I'm going to kill you. How dare you hurt me, your patriarch, with the explosion. I'm going to kill you." Qin Shuwen, who was nearly hysterical, suddenly threw his head back and let out a shrill cry into the sky, "Wu Qi, your patriarch, will definitely kill you." Wu Qi, who was sent flying several hundred feet away by the enormous airwaves unleashed by the explosive talisman and nearly had all his bones and joints shattered, stood up from the ground while letting out a strange laugh. He stood up inch by inch and slowly straightened his body. Casually, he took out an innate water pill and shoved it into his mouth, using the medicinal strength to stimulate his innate water energy and nourish his damaged meridians, bones and flesh. After that, Wu Qi fixed his gaze on Qin Shuwen and strode towards him. "Want to kill me? Old dog, Wu Qi, will fight you to the death." The will to fight that came from the depth of Wu Wang's soul was burning like a raging flame. Wu Qi's eyes had turned bloodshot. Once someone showed hostility towards you, you would use the most violent method to destroy him. Completely destroy his will and flesh, his soul, and everything he had. This was the best reward to the enemy. With a hideous smile on his face, Wu Qi came next to Qin Shuwen, whose face had turned pale. He pressed both palms forcefully on both sides of Qin Shuwen's chest, covering the position of his lungs. Qin Shuwen was cultivating the Raging Thunder Sword technique, a variant sword technique of gold element. Among the 5 elements in the human body, gold meridians originated from both lungs, and were the source of the Great White Energy essence. For those who cultivated gold element cultivation technique, the most vital part of their foundation was located in both lungs. Soundlessly, the pure and dense innate water energy invaded into the body of Qin Shuwen, who was nearly in a coma. It was like the spring breeze and rain that nourished everything silently. In just a blink of an eye, it had found out the current condition of Qin Shuwen's body. Jin Dan was severely injured, his body was severely wounded, and his spirit was nearly in a coma from the shock. At this moment, Qin Shuwen was like a city that had lost all its soldiers, completely defenseless. The innate water energy went straight into Qin Shuwen's body, but it did not cause any reaction from him. Quietly, Wu Qi unleashed his divine sense, carefully checking on Haoying Xiong, Haoying Fengying, and a few other men. They had been knocked unconscious by the tremendous destructive force produced by the explosive talisman, and none of them had noticed what was happening here. Wu Qi put his mind at ease. With a hideous smile on his face, he exercised the mystic technique found in Scroll of Stealing. An invisible whirlpool emerged in the center of his palm. Wu Qi exercised the innate water energy and wrapped around Qin Shuwen's lungs bit by bit. Qin Shuwen had the innate foundation of Tao cultivation, and his innate spirit seed was bred in both of his lungs. When a cultivator stepped into the realm of Xiantian, the innate spirit seed would be nourished by the innate energy, like a seed receiving nourishment from the rain. Gradually, it would grow into a spirit sprout, which would eventually develop into the spirit root for Tao cultivation. Along with the improvement of the cultivator's cultivation, the innate spirit root would gradually grow and grow. It would spread out from the place where it was bred, and gradually extend into all the internal organs, changing the innate properties of the body, transforming the human body into the unique body constitution of a cultivator. When a cultivator stepped into the realm of Jin Dan, the innate spirit root would have attained a great accomplishment. Qin Shuwen had the cultivation of middle stage of Jin Dan realm, and the spirit root that extended out from both of his lungs had transformed all his internal organs into the element of gold. When Wu Qi peeped into his body with his divine sense, he found that all his internal organs had turned into a hazy, silvery white color. Currently, Qin Shuwen's heart, liver, spleen, and kidneys still carried a tiny bit of the original color of 5 elements. When all 4 of his important organs had turned into a pure silvery white color, looking like a pure piece of silver without any other color, he would have stepped into the late stage of Jin Dan realm. His entire body would have transformed into the body of gold, and he would have the foundation to form his nascent soul. At this moment, when Wu Qi peeped into his body with his divine sense, Wu Qi found that both of Qin Shuwen's lungs had turned into a pure silver color, glinting with a dazzling silver light. The razor-sharp grand white energy was rolling and rocking in both of his lungs. Wisps of sharp energy kept flowing out from both of his lungs, invading the other 4 important organs. The enormous grand white gold energy had condensed into a vague shadow of a tree root in both of Qin Shuwen's lungs. Part of the root went straight through his dantian and connected with the Jin Dan realm, while the other part extended along his meridians, drilling into his heart, liver, spleen, and kidneys. If you were cultivating with some other cultivation technique, I wouldn't be able to deal with you. But, it's a cultivation technique of gold element. Gold gives birth to water, and the energy of gold element can be transformed into the energy of Kuei water. Wu Qi grinned hideously. Suddenly, a faint sound of waves was heard coming out from his palm. The innate water energy suddenly burst out with a frightening suction force. The silvery white energy in both of Qin Shuwen's lungs suddenly faded away. The natal gold element energy that he had painstakingly cultivated for several hundred years was being absorbed into Wu Qi's body, quickly transforming into an extremely pure innate water energy and storing it in Wu Qi's water meridians. Not only the natal gold element energy that was leaking out, the innate spirit root in both of Qin Shi Wen's lungs that had already taken shape suddenly had countless of its root system crack. The natal innate energy that formed the innate spirit root was also absorbed into Wu Qi's body, quickly merging into Wu Qi's lungs. In just a blink of an eye, Wu Qi felt that the function of both of his lungs had improved by a lot, and even his breathing had become much easier. This was an opportunity to change a person's constitution from the root. Wu Qi crazily stole the spirit root that Qin Shi Wen had cultivated with great effort, then slowly condensed the natal innate energy in both of his lungs into a tiny innate spirit root of metal element. This was the scariest thing about scroll of stealing. As long as the elemental attribute was the same, there was nothing under the heaven that could not be stolen. Even your innate talent, your innate aptitude, everything about you could be stolen from your own body, turning it into your own innate talent for others to use. Originally, Qin Shi Wen's innate talent in cultivation could be considered as an upper tier, but it was just at the edge of upper tier. But today, after Wu Qi extracted his natal innate energy, his innate talent in cultivation had dropped by 1 grade, from the edge of upper tier to the upper tier of mid-tier. From today onwards, the speed of Qin Shi Wen's cultivation would be greatly slowed down. No matter it was the speed of absorbing natural energies, or the efficiency of transforming natural energies into his own energy, all of them would be at least 30% slower than before. Initially, he still had the hope of breaking through to the nascent soul realm. But now, it was nearly impossible. Exerting all his strength, Wu Qi fused all the natal gold element energy and natal innate energy that he could steal from Qin Shi Wen's body into his own body. After that, he fixed his eyes on Qin Shi Wen's kidneys. Gold gave birth to water. For those who cultivated gold element cultivation technique, when the gold element energy was absorbed by the kidneys, it could be easily transformed into the energy of kidney water. Therefore, the energy essence around Qin Shi Wen's kidneys was very powerful. In other words, in some aspects, his functions were very powerful as well, at least 100 times more powerful than an ordinary man. You're not cultivating with a water element cultivation technique, so why do you need 2 good kidneys? You old pervert, you're already a few hundred years old, yet you still have such a powerful energy source in your kidneys. How many innocent girls do you want to rape every night? Well, today, I'll fulfill your wish. After flipping the unconscious Qin Shi Wen over, Wu Qi pressed both palms forcefully onto Qin Shi Wen's waist. He exerted the full power of the hand of web. A faint blue light shone out from Wu Qi's palms. With all his effort, he began to crazily extract the enormous water element energy from Qin Shi Wen's kidneys, fusing it into his own body. A cold feeling flowed into his body through his palms, and quickly fused into his kidneys. The cold feeling quickly transformed into a scorching heat in Wu Qi's kidneys. He could feel his energy getting better and better. His kidneys were like 2 powerful engines, driving a certain part of his lower abdomen to change its shape, turning it as hard as steel, and as hot as fire. A cultivator of Jin Dan realm indeed has an abundant source of energy. Wonderful, the energy in the kidneys is exactly the same as the cultivation technique of water chapter. Watch me drain your kidney energy. When stealing the source energy of gold element from Qin Shi Wen's lungs, Wu Qi could only steal a very small part of Qin Shi Wen's source energy, due to the difference in their cultivation and the ratio of gold element to Kuei water. However, the source energy of Qin Shi Wen's kidneys was an innate water element. Therefore, when Wu Qi used the water chapter cultivation technique to extract Qin Shi Wen's kidney energy, it was as easy as blowing off dust. Although it was also limited by his cultivation, Wu Qi still managed to steal at least 30% of Qin Shi Wen's kidney energy. When the clamor came from the outside of Heaven's Will Palace, Wu Qi had already plundered everything he could from Qin Shi Wen's body. Slowly, he coughed out a mouthful of blood and fell to the ground, pretending to be dead. Chapter 89. One after another, footprints were left deep on the floor of Heaven's Will Palace. The footprints were 3 inches deep, and the lines on them were clear and distinct. Even the lines on the toes could be seen clearly. Clad in a white robe, Nia Baihong had his hands clasped behind his back, and his long hair hung loosely behind his back. Through the corner of his eyes, Wu Qi glanced at the footprints left under Nia Baihong's feet, wondering if Nia Baihong was destroying everything wherever he went. Even the sturdy floor of Heaven's Will Palace, which was protected by defensive formations, couldn't withstand his sword energies. If he went to the Imperial Palace of Great Yan Dynasty, would he also destroy the floor of the Imperial Palace? Would Yan Dan ask him to pay for the repair fees? With a subtle smile on his face, Nia Baihong came next to Wu Qi. He lowered his head and looked at Wu Qi, who was gasping for breath, coughing out a mouthful of blood, and had a few bloody marks all over his body. Gasping for breath was the result of Wu Qi activating the concealing technique found in Scroll of Stealing, concealing his aura. Coughing out a mouthful of blood was the result of his internal organs being injured by the shockwave. The bloody marks on his body were caused by his own sword. Since his internal organs were injured by the shockwave, why would he care about these minor injuries? In short, Wu Qi looked like he was severely injured, like a pitiful little kitten who had been trampled by 10 elephants in turn. With great effort, Wu Qi opened his eyes, squeezed out a strained smile and said, "Moss. Master, why did Elder Qin want to kill me?" With a simple question, not only did Wu Qi bring the relationship between him and Nia Baihong closer, he had also pushed all the responsibility to Qin Shuwen. In front of nearly 100 disciples of heaven-breaking sword sect, Wu Qi had addressed Nia Baihong as his master. How could he not handle this matter impartially? Well, once he handled this matter impartially, saying that it was Qin Shuwen who wanted to kill Wu Qi, and Wu Qi was just defending himself, it was needless to say who was responsible for this matter. The corner of Nia Baihong's mouth curved up, and the subtle smile became more obvious. With a twitch of his finger, Nia Baihong fished out a pale silver pill and threw it towards Wu Qi. Wu Qi opened his mouth and swallowed the pill in one gulp. Immediately, a medicinal strength with a slight cutting power flowed through his entire body, rapidly healing the injuries caused by the thunder strength in Wu Qi's body. Visible electric light spurted out from Wu Qi's pores, and thin blue light danced on his skin, turning him into a man of light. Snorting coldly, Nia Baihong cried out unhappily, "It is indeed the raging gold element thunder force. Elder Qin, the older you get, the more useless you become. How could you attack a new disciple?" A Jin Dan middle-stage human immortal attacked a Khanate Daoist master and was injured to this extent. How can the heaven-breaking swordsmanship sect elders guild keep their face? Qin Shuwen, who was lying on the ground and badly mutilated, showed no reaction at all. No matter who it was, after his dantian was nearly pierced through, his Jin Dan was severely damaged and cracked, and the prime energies in his lungs and kidneys were plundered, it was impossible for him to remain conscious. Blood was slowly oozing out from Qin Shuwen's body, spreading out and forming a large pool of blood on the ground. Nia Baihong didn't say anything. None of the disciples of heaven-breaking swordsmanship sect who followed him to Heaven's Will Palace dared to save Qin Shuwen. Wu Qi gasped for a few breaths, then stood up from the ground. He bowed at Nia Baihong and said with a serious tone, "Thank you, Master, for giving me the medicine. But why is this raging thunder force so evil? I was nearly killed by him. Not only did he hurt me with his internal energy, he even hacked me so many times with his sword, leaving me with scars all over my body. How am I going to find a wife in the future?" While complaining, Wu Qi took off his shirt, exposing all the sword wounds on his body for those disciples of heaven-breaking swordsmanship sect to admire. While sighing and asking Nia Baihong why Qin Shuwen wanted to kill him, he took out a bottle of gold wound ointment and carefully applied it on those sword wounds. He applied the ointment to stop the bleeding, and circulated his innate energy to heal the wounds. Although these wounds looked scary, they were not really dangerous. Upon hearing Wu Qi's question, Nia Baihong sighed lightly and cooperated with him. "I'm afraid Elder Qin's cultivation has been growing too fast, and his state of mind couldn't keep up with the growth of his cultivation. That's why he became so arrogant and rebellious. But no matter what, as a dignified elder, he attacked a new disciple, and even wounded himself to this extent. This is just too unreasonable. Wu Qi didn't say anything. Both of them stood side by side, looking at Qin Shuwen, who was lying quietly on the ground. Blood kept oozing out from Qin Shuwen's body, and pale golden Dan energies kept dispersing from his body. The Dan energies were the foundation of the Jin Dan. Every time a Dan energy was lost, his cultivation would drop by one level. At this point in time, Qin Shuwen's cultivation had almost dropped to the initial stage of Jin Dan realm. In another 15 minutes, perhaps his Jin Dan cultivation would be completely gone. If the Jin Dan disappeared completely, Qin Shuwen's several hundred years of painstaking cultivation would be gone as well, and he would immediately become an ordinary mortal. An ordinary mortal only had a lifespan of about 100 years. Once the Jin Dan disappeared, Qin Shuwen's lifespan would be depleted, and he would die with all his cultivation gone. What Wu Qi and Nie Baihong were watching quietly was the journey of a human immortal of middle stage of Jin Dan realm walking step by step towards death. After the time it took to finish a pot of tea, Wu Qi noticed that Qin Shuwen was having difficulty breathing. Only then did Wu Qi pretend to ask, "Master, no matter what, Elder Qin is an elder of our sect. Shouldn't we save him?" It is not easy to cultivate to the stage of Jin Dan realm. It would be a pity if he were to die like this. Nie Baihong pondered for a brief moment, then fished out 2 medicine bottles from his sleeve and threw them over to Wu Qi. Forget it. After all, he is an elder of our sect. Although his way of doing things is a little absurd, he is still an elder. It is his fault that he wanted to kill you. But, as a junior of heaven-breaking sword sect, you can only repay evil with good. You should go and save Elder Qin, so that he will owe you a favor. In the future, he will never attack you again. Nie Baihong smiled happily, but there was an indescribable weirdness in his smile. Wu Qi narrowed his eyes and smiled as well. Qin Shuwen was blown to this state by Wu Qi's explosive talisman, and his foundation of cultivation was stolen by Wu Qi secretly. Now, he even wanted to owe Wu Qi a favor for saving his life. Qin Shuwen, oh Qin Shuwen, how are you going to fight with your Lord Wu Qi in the future? Do you still have the face to show up in front of your Lord Wu Qi? Nie Baihong, oh Nie Baihong, you are a ruthless man. You are humiliating Qin Shuwen to death. With both hands clasped behind his back, Nie Baihong breathed out a faint sigh and said, "The favor of saving my life, tisk." Raising his head up proudly, Nie Baihong stared at the ceiling of Heaven's Will Palace. Gradually, his eyes lost their focus. Obviously, he was having a daydream. Smilingly, Wu Qi carried 2 medicine bottles and came next to Qin Shuwen. First, he used a bottle of 9 Ganoderma Heaven replenishing ointment to treat his external wounds, then he poured a bottle of Trigolden Life seizing pill into Qin Shuwen's mouth. He stimulated the medicinal strength and forcibly raised Qin Shuwen's life force, stimulating him to quickly wake up. After all, he was a cultivator of Jin Dan realm. Once he woke up, his body immediately reacted. The light green-colored 9 Ganoderma Heaven replenishing ointment was quickly absorbed into his body. Next to the wound on his dantian, new flesh began to grow rapidly, and the bull-sized hole began to heal at a speed visible to the naked eyes. A faint white mist sprayed out from the top of his head. The Trigolden Life seizing pill was dispelling the clotted blood in his body, mending his meridians, and restoring the energy essence that was consumed due to his injuries. It was easy to restore energy essence, but the innate root of cultivating Tao was something intangible. How could the pills in the world of cultivators be able to replenish the loss of energy essence in this aspect? Qin Shuwen, whose face was glowing with blood and flesh, was now shriveled and skinny like a piece of old tree bark, as if he had lost his original form. However, Wu Qi made things worse. When Qin Shuwen woke up, he smilingly nodded at him and said, "Elder Qin, you're awake." It was me who saved you with the heaven replenishing ointment and life seizing pill. It was me who saved you, but please don't think that it was someone else who saved you." Upon hearing Wu Qi's words, Qin Shuwen immediately felt both angry and anxious. His lungs and kidneys, which had lost too much of their innate energy essence, were suffering a severe pain at the same time. With a loud cry, he coughed out a mouthful of blood with a strange color, a mixture of pale silver and black. Obviously, it was the blood essence that flowed out from his lungs and kidneys. With this mouthful of blood, his foundation had been damaged by another 30%. Upon seeing this, Wu Qi did not say another word. He quickly put away the medicine bottle and retreated to the back. He couldn't tease Qin Shuwen anymore, or else, this old fellow would really die of anger. If that happened, no one would be able to repay the debt of saving this old fellow's life. However, even though he did not say anything, Nia Baihong, who was standing beside him, said coolly, "Forget it. As a dignified elder of heaven-breaking sword sect, it is a great humiliation for a newly joined disciple to end up like this. In the name of the sect leader of heaven-breaking sword sect, I hereby expel Qin Shuwen from the elder council. Wu Qi, you're able to defeat an elder of Jin Dan realm in a face-to-face battle. Let's not talk about your bone structure and innate talent, but your courage and ability to adapt to the situation are really rare. You shall be my new disciple." With that, Wu Qi had skipped the status of second grade and first grade disciple, and directly became Nia Baihong's new disciple. Wu Qi did not reject the offer. He hastily bowed and thanked Nia Baihong while laughing. Qin Shuwen's unsightly face changed instantly. He stared fixedly at Nia Baihong, gasping for breath like a broken bellows coming out from his throat. Suddenly, he coughed out another 3 mouthfuls of blood essence from his internal organs. After these 3 mouthfuls of blood, Qin Shuwen fell backward, and his aura quickly dispersed. Wu Qi was taken aback. Was this old fellow going to die of anger just like that? Meanwhile, the corner of Nia Baihong's mouth curved upwards, and a subtle smile appeared on his face. All of a sudden, a clump of dark watery light shot into heaven's palace from the outside. A cold and gloomy voice scolded angrily, "What is the meaning of this, sect leader? Are you really going to force old Qin to his death? As the sect leader, your words and actions are against the rules, and you even provoked the elders with words. This is simply absurd and unreasonable." The watery light landed right next to Qin Shuwen. From within the watery light, a tall and skinny girl clad in black clothes suddenly appeared. The girl was half a head taller than Qin Shuwen. Although her body was dry and flat like a chopping board, devoid of any curves, she had a very beautiful face. However, on this beautiful face that looked like a 16-year-old girl, there was an eerie coldness, giving one the feeling that she was a 1,000-years-old zombie that had just crawled out from a coffin. Nia Baihong glared at the girl, sneered and said, "What is the meaning of this, Elder Shengguan? Don't tell me that I have the intention to frame Elder Qin." The girl clad in black, Shengguan Yuhong, gazed fixedly at Nia Baihong. Suddenly, she snorted coldly, and a dark beam shot out from her waist like a waterfall, thrusting straight towards Wu Qi's chest. Shengguan Yuhong let out a shrill cry and said, "Today, I'll kill you, a little bastard who has no respect for his superiors." Nia Baihong was instantly enraged. He bellowed furiously, "How dare you? Wu Qi is the inner sect disciple acknowledged by me. Who dares to touch even a single hair of his?" A razor-sharp sword energy shot out from Nia Baihong's body. He opened his mouth and shot out a 30-feet-long white beam, clashing and tangling with the dark beam. Clanging noises of swords kept ringing out. Nia Baihong's body remained motionless, but Shengguan Yuhong's body was trembling violently, and she was forced to take 18 steps back. Basically, every time the black and white sword beams clashed, she would take a step back. 18 steps later, a plaintive cry was heard, as the black sword beam burst out with a large sheet of light rain, its color dimmed, and was pushed back at top speed. Shengguan Yuhong let out a miserable cry, as 2 streams of blood burst out from her nostrils. Chapter 90. Nya Baihong sneered. Suddenly, 3 thumb-sized white mists rushed out from the top of his head, transforming into 3 white sword shadows and wheeling in the sky. Then, they merged back into one and returned to his body. The sword beams shot out from his mouth, took 9 rounds around his body, and finally transformed into a cold beam that was as thin as a strand of hair and nearly 1 foot long. Then, they were swallowed by Nya Baihong. Shangguan Yuhong's face turned dark. She stared fixedly at Nya Baihong, sneered, and said, "The unity of profound swords, sect leader has indeed mastered the supreme sword technique of heaven-breaking sword sect. What a pity, what a pity. The heaven-breaking sword technique is missing the earth and fire sword techniques, and sect leader has only mastered the 3 unity of profound swords. If you could master the 5 unity of profound swords, perhaps you would be able to form your nascent soul right away." Nya Baihong smiled proudly, then said in a cold voice, "Even if we don't have the earth and fire sword techniques, the unity of profound swords is still the supreme sword technique of our sect. Elder Shangguan, this time, are you convinced? I repeat, Wu Qi is now an inner sect disciple of our sect. Who dares to touch even a single hair of his?" Shangguan Yuhong's eyes flickered as she stared at Wu Qi without saying a word. A few cold beams flashed outside the Heavenswell Palace, as a few old men with different outfits and mannerisms revealed themselves from the sword beams. They first gave the severely wounded Qin Shuwen a look, then turned to look at Shangguan Yuhong, whose chest was stained with blood. After that, they asked Nya Baihong at the same time. "Sect leader, why is Elder Qin wounded like this? And who is the one who wounded Elder Shangguan?" Nya Baihong just kept grinning coldly. He raised his head up proudly and threw a sidelong glance at these elders. After the time it took to finish a pot of tea, he left these elders hanging on the spot. When all the elders' faces had turned livid, and when they could no longer restrain their anger and were about to fly into a rage, Nya Baihong said in an indifferent tone, "Wu Qi, my disciple, tell these elders about the cause and effect of the incident." With a wronged and fearful expression on his face, Wu Qi took a few careful steps forward, then like a frightened bird, he hastily moved closer to Nya Baihong. He lowered his voice and described what had happened in an aggrieved manner. In Wu Qi's narration, Qin Shuwen had turned into a murderous devil, and for some unknown reason, he tried to kill him. Wu Qi was just a pitiful and innocent disciple who was being persecuted by Qin Shuwen. He was forced into a desperate situation, and that was why he risked his life to counterattack and severely wounded Qin Shuwen. Pitifully looking at Shangguan Yuhong and the other sect elders, Wu Qi said in an aggrieved tone, "I was forced to do this." The few sect elders looked at each other, then gave Qin Shuwen a close look at the terrible wounds on his body. They sensed that Qin Shuwen's cultivation had dropped by 1 realm, and his aura had become much weaker. They couldn't help but frown at the same time. A bald sect elder, who only had a small tuft of white hair on the back of his head, sneered and shouted, "This Wu Qi, which clan does he belong to?" Clearing his throat, Wu Qi bowed at the sect elder and said with a deep voice, "Wu Qi is the chief hanger-on of Duke Yan Lu, Duke Qingfeng, Zhuo Guozheng." Silence. The few sect elders fell into a long silence. After a long while, the white-haired sect elder suddenly laughed coldly and said, "Ha ha, ha ha, interesting, very interesting. The hanger-on of Duke Yan Lu actually wounded an sect elder of heaven-breaking sword sect? Lawless, this is simply lawless. Wasn't this Duke Yan Lu Yan Buji? How did he become Yan Qingfeng?" Nya Baihong also cleared his throat, then told them about the accidental death of Yan Buji, and how Lu Qingfeng was the first one who arrived at Ji City and inherited all his belongings. With a dry voice, Nya Baihong said, "Recently, all the sect elders are in a secluded cultivation, so we have no idea about the replacement of Duke Yan Lu." Suddenly, Shangguan Yuhong interrupted. She pointed her finger at Wu Qi and snapped, "For the sake of this lucky Yan Qingfeng's hanger-on, sect leader, are you going to allow Elder Qin to be wounded like this? Not only did sect leader not avenge Elder Qin, but you even shielded this Wu Qi. What is your intention, sect leader?" Nia Baihong's face darkened instantly. He stared straight at Shengguan Yuhong and said with a gloomy voice, "If he is just the hanger-on of Duke Yanluo, I wouldn't care about his life or death. But, as for Wu Qi, he is the disciple personally sent by Princess Xiangluo, who asked me to take him as my disciple." Princess Xiangluo made it clear that if anything were to happen to Wu Qi, she would deduct the supply of energy stones and magical items that Heaven-Breaking Sword sect is supposed to receive next year, and the supply of energy stones and magical items in the future will be greatly reduced as well. Nia Baihong snorted angrily, then said furiously, "If Elder Qin really killed Wu Qi, Princess Xiangluo would fly into a rage and really deduct the supply of energy stones and magical items from Heaven-Breaking Sword sect. Who can bear the responsibility? Who? Which sect elder has the guts to solve this problem? If so, I won't interfere in the matter between Elder Qin and Wu Qi. Who? Who can solve this problem?" Silence. Shengguan Yuhong shut her mouth tightly, and the other few sect elders were busy talking about something else, no longer paying any attention to the wounded Qin Shuwen. Nia Baihong sneered, breathed out a long breath, stared at these sect elders and said with a cold voice, putting aside the relationship between Princess Xiangluo, "As a human immortal of middle stage of Jin Dan realm, Elder Qin has the body of an immortal. However, he was severely wounded by Wu Qi, a mere Daoist of meridian cultivating tier. It was Elder Qin who launched a sneak attack on Wu Qi first, and was even wounded by Wu Qi in the end. If this were to be spread out, would Elder Qin still be able to face anyone?" Qin Shuwen, who had just regained some of his spirit and was silently circulating his energy to regulate his breath, had his mind thrown into chaos. He glared angrily at Nia Baihong, and sticky blood burst out from his 7 apertures almost at the same time. Trembling, he pointed his finger at Nia Baihong, threw his head back and shouted, "This is infuriating." After that, Qin Shuwen's body turned stiff, and he fell backward. Hastily, the white-haired sect elder grabbed Qin Shuwen and pulled him into his arms. The few sect elders looked at each other. 2 of them shook their heads, transformed into sword beams and flew away. Meanwhile, Shengguan Yuhong, the white-haired sect elder, and the other 3 sect elders were still staying in Heaven's Will Palace. They gave each other a meaningful glance, then communicated with some unknown mystic technique. In the end, it was still Shengguan Yuhong who took 2 steps forward and started to attack Wu Qi. Even so, Wu Qi did not respect the seniors of the sect, and brazenly used an explosive talisman to wound Elder Qin. "Even if we can't expel him from the sect because of his relationship with Princess Xiangluo, he still has to be punished." The white-haired sect elder shook his head, then quickly chimed in, "What Elder Shengguan said is absolutely right. If everyone behaves like Wu Qi, easily attacking the sect elders, then the rules of our sect will be too lawless. Among the rules of Heaven-Breaking Sword sect, respecting the seniors of the sect, and no one is allowed to deceive the sect elders. This is the first rule." Nia Baihong's face turned serious again. He snorted coldly and narrowed his eyes. Wu Qi, who looked extremely timid and aggrieved just a moment ago, suddenly breathed out a sigh. He straightened his back, clasped both hands behind his back, and looked at the few sect elders with a cold grin on his face. Wu Qi spat on the ground, then used the sole of his boot to rub the spit on the ground. He sneered and said, "It seems like the few sect elders are really determined to defeat Wu Qi. You don't want to let me go, do you? You want to punish me, do you? Do you want to force me to death?" Stretching out the middle finger of his right hand, Wu Qi pointed at the noses of Shengguan Yuhong and the few sect elders. With a ferocious voice, he said, "Look at you bunch of thieves and prostitutes, what the hell are you? All of you are old fools who have lived for several hundred years, yet you want to argue with me, a junior who has not even reached his 20s. You have lived all your years in vain." Slapping his own chest forcefully and producing loud popping sounds, Wu Qi roared like a gangster, "You want to kill me, don't you? You want to punish me, don't you? Elder Shengguan, come, use your flying sword and stab it into my heart." If your master Wu Qi blinks his eyes, he will be raised by you. Come, stab me, use your flying sword and stab me. If you don't have the guts to stab me, you will be raised by Master Wu Qi's concubine. Wu Qi's words were too unpleasant to hear. Shangguan Yuhong's face turned purple instantly. She let out a furious roar that sounded like she had gone mad, and the black sword beam shot out once again. Wu Qi narrowed his eyes and stared straight at Shangguan Yuhong's sword beam. If her flying sword really came stabbing at him, he would definitely use a mystic technique found in Scroll of Stealing, fleeing at top speed even at the cost of his prime energy essence. After that, he would risk everything and fight with these few sect elders of heaven-breaking sword sect until one of them was dead. However, before Shangguan Yuhong's sword beam could be unleashed, Nia Baihong had already snorted coldly and stood in front of Wu Qi. He sneered and said, "Wu Qi, shut up. Elder Shangguan, you are really a good-for-nothing. Wu Qi is right about one thing, you are men who have lived for several hundred years, but have you been living your life like a dog?" Seeing that Nia Baihong had stepped out to protect Wu Qi, Shangguan Yuhong's face fell once again. She pointed her finger at Wu Qi and roared furiously, "What an arrogant kid. You are. When had Shangguan Yuhong ever seen a man like Wu Qi, who was so rude? She, who stood high and mighty, had never been insulted like this before. It took her a long time to figure out what Wu Qi meant when he scolded her. When she finally figured out what Wu Qi meant with his filthy words, she was so angry that she nearly went crazy. Even though Wu Qi was backed by Princess Xianglu, she still swore that she would kill Wu Qi at all costs. However, Nia Baihong was standing in front of her, and she was really no match for him. Wu Qi sneered, looking at these Jin Dan sect elders with an extremely arrogant expression. Weren't they just human immortals of Jin Dan realm? If Wu Qi was given a little more time, in his eyes, human immortals were just some ants that he could crush with one finger. Even though he was no match for a human immortal now, it would not be easy for Shangguan Yuhong to kill him. Not to mention that he had already grasped the pulse of heaven-breaking swordsmanship sect, and had seen through some serious disputes in it. He was betting that no matter how badly he offended Shangguan Yuhong, Nia Baihong would definitely protect him at all costs. Since he had figured this out, why would he still pretend to be a child bride who had been bullied? Naturally, he would be as arrogant as he could be. The more arrogant he could be, the better it would be. Spitting on the ground again, Wu Qi looked at Shangguan Yuhong contemptuously, sneered and said, "You don't have the guts to kill me, it's true. Elder Shangguan, even if I lend you 3 more dog guts, you still won't have the guts to kill me. You're a woman, you're just a coward. If you have the guts, stab me in the heart with your sword." Once again, Wu Qi patted on his own chest. Shangguan Yuhong's eyes turned bloodshot because of anger. Her body trembled violently, and suddenly, she threw her head back and let out a furious roar, then opened her mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood. The white-haired sect elder was so angry that the corners of his eyes twitched. He and the other 3 sect elders took a step forward at the same time, eager to strike. Nia Baihong snorted coldly. Once again, 3 streams of white mist rushed out from the top of his head, transforming into sword shadows and wheeling rapidly around him. Seeing this, Wu Qi was bursting with joy. He could not hold back his laughter, and suddenly threw his head back and let out a loud, ear-piercing laughter that made the entire Heavens Will Palace buzz. Chapter 91. Amidst Wu Qi's wild laughter, Shangguan Yuhong let out a hysterical curse, while a beam of black light shot out from her waist. The white-haired sect elder and the other 3 sect elders shouted at Chi-Chi as well, while 4 sword beams, 1 green, 1 white, and 2 black, shot out. All of a sudden, the entire Heavens Will Palace was filled with a chilly air, while immense sword energies shot out in all directions, forcing all the disciples of heaven-breaking sword sect to flee in all directions. "How dare you!" Nia Baihong narrowed his eyes, and his pupils shrunk to the size of a needle tip. With 3 white sword beams wheeling above his head, Nia Baihong cried out, "Fine. Today, I'll let you know that the surname of heaven-breaking sword sect is Nye. Unity of sword energies, go. Then, he opened his mouth and spat out 5 white sword beams, which transformed into long rainbows and greeted the 5 sword beams in front of him. All of a sudden, the 3 white sword beams above his head dispersed, turning into countless streams of swift and fierce sword energies and merging with the 5 white rainbows. After the 9-feet-long sword beams merged with the sword energies transformed from the sword beams spat out by Nye Baihong abruptly became 30 feet long, vigorous and agile. They were at least a few times stronger than the sword beams unleashed by Shengguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders. In an instant, 10 sword beams tangled and clashed with each other, producing jarring metal clanging noises that shook the entire Heavens Will Palace. The surging sword energies dispersed in all directions, and large amounts of sparks were seen flashing across the pitch-black floor. The defensive formations deployed on the floor of Heavens Will Palace were shattered one after another, with long and deep sword marks being left on the floor. Nye Baihong clenched his fists tightly, while a foot-long white beam shot out from his eyes. Sword energies surged from all over his body, while his long hair stood erect. Every now and then, his long hair would sway and produce a sonorous and jarring sword cry. The secret art of unity of sword energies, which could only be inherited by the sect leader of heaven-breaking sword sect, allowed Nye Baihong to transform himself into a flying sword, an extremely hard, indestructible, and emotionless killing sword. A series of cracking noises lingered in the air, as the ground under Nye Baihong's feet cracked inch by inch. In just a blink of an eye, a round pit with a diameter of 30 feet and a depth of 2 feet was created. Wisps of white mist gathered from all directions and kept sucking into Nye Baihong's body. After that, he breathed out mouthful after mouthful of white mist, fusing it with the 5 sword beams, transforming into a long rainbow and fighting against 5 Jin Dan realm elders at the same time. Shengguan Yuhong and the other 4 Jin Dan sect elders had joined hands to fight against Nye Baihong. However, they were forced to tremble continuously by the 5 white beams, and their steps were weak and unsteady. The 2 weakest sect elders were gasping for breath while retreating step by step. Nye Baihong's sword beam contained a tremendous force, which completely suppressed all 5 sect elders, making them breathless. He wanted to retract his sword light, but he couldn't. He wanted to retract the thread of nascent divinity attached to his sword beam, but he couldn't. Like a muddy swamp, Nye Baihong's 5 white beams had tightly bound the sword beams of Shengguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders, slowly whittling away the nascent divinity and energy essence attached to their sword beams inch by inch, while squeezing out the energy in their bodies bit by bit. Hiding behind Nye Baihong's back, Wu Qi laughed. He said in a deep voice, "You really have the guts to attack me? That means you have disregarded the face of Princess Xianglu, disregarded the dignity of the sect leader, and are bent on killing me to vent your anger? Hee, since you want to kill me, then we are mortal enemies. What else do you want to say?" A strange laugh rang out, as a strong beam of light burst out from the storage ring worn on Wu Qi's finger. It was the autumn water sword given by Nye Baihong to Wu Qi, shooting out from the sword beam along with a 1-foot-long, pale green beam, sweeping towards Shengguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders. Shocked cries of nearly 100 heaven-breaking sword sect's disciples rang out in the Heavens Will Palace. Amidst the cries, a large amount of blood burst out from the chests of Shengguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders. The 5 sect elders, who were being pressured by Nye Baihong to the point that they could hardly breathe and had all their attention focused on their sword beams, never in their wildest dreams did they expect that Wu Qi, a disciple who had just joined the sect, could actually control a flying sword. They could not believe that Wu Qi actually had the courage to attack them. However, Wu Qi, who was a lawless and ferocious man deep in his bones, still did it. Although the autumn water sword was just a lower-grade flying sword, it was much tougher than a fleshly body. As the 5 sect elders were fighting Nye Baihong with all their strength, they did not circulate their energy to protect their bodies, and neither did they have any spirit items that could actively protect their bodies. Wherever the sword beam swept across, all 5 sect elders were slashed from the left chest to the right ribs, leaving behind a deep and long wound that went straight through their internal organs. A large amount of blood sprayed out from their wounds, while Shengguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders let out a miserable howl. Ignoring the fact that they were still fighting Nie Baihong, all 5 of them forcibly cut off the connection with their flying swords, covered their wounds and retreated hastily. Hot blood sprayed all over the ground, while their faces turned deathly pale. Nie Baihong sneered. Suddenly, 2 feet of white beams shot out from both of his eyes, while the 5 white beams that were crazily fighting above his head shone with a dazzling light. 5 crisp cracking noises echoed out, as the flying swords of Shengguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders were broken at the same time, turning into several dozens of pieces of scrap metal that were spraying countless bright specks and falling down at high speed. These 5 flying swords were sharp weapons that Shengguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders had spent at least 200 years of painstaking cultivation. Since the beginning of their cultivation, they had used their own blood essence to temper these 5 flying swords. After a few rounds of reforging and tempering, these 5 flying swords had long reached the level of supreme-grade magical items, nearing the level of lower-grade magical treasures. They were connected with the 5 sect elders by blood and soul, and had nearly become a part of their lives. At this moment, when their flying swords were broken, all 5 sect elders coughed out a mouthful of blood at the same time, falling to the ground on their butts in a sorry state. Wu Qi's autumn water sword had brutally slashed across their bodies from left to right, nearly breaking their thoracic vertebrae. Nie Baihong was even more vicious, as he simply destroyed the prime magical items that they had refined with their lives. Being attacked from both inside and outside, the 5 sect elders had suffered a severe injury to their vitality. How could they still have the strength to stand? A sword cry rang out, as Wu Qi retracted the autumn water sword. Innate water energy covered his entire body. Stealthily, Wu Qi performed an incantation gesture, getting ready to activate a mystic technique and flee for his life. After all, they were 5 sect elders of Jin Dan realm. He had brazenly launched a sneak attack on the sect elders, and even severely wounded all 5 of them at the same time. If it were any other sect, wouldn't it be a capital offense? However, Wu Qi had already mentally prepared himself. Once something went wrong, he would immediately flee, even though it would cost him some of his prime blood essence. After all, it was easy for him to obtain his prime blood essence, so he did not feel any heartache. Nie Baihong let out a long laugh, as he opened his mouth and swallowed the 5 white beams back into his body. Then, countless white sword energies in the air gradually converged into 3 sword shadows, and in the blink of an eye, they squeezed back into the top of his head. Taking a deep breath, Nie Baihong let out a long laugh and said, "Wu Qi, how dare you? I'm having a sword battle with all the sect elders, and you actually sneak attack them from the back." Upon hearing Nie Baihong's words, Wu Qi moved his fingers and nearly activated the mystic technique to flee for his life. However, Nie Baihong sneered, then he laughed out loud and said, "However, considering that you were anxious to protect your master, and had unintentionally attacked and made a mistake, I'll not pursue this matter any further. Go apologize to the 5 sect elders, and apologize to them. After all, you're a junior, and the 5 sect elders will feel embarrassed to make things difficult for you." Upon hearing Nie Baihong's words, Wu Qi was immediately amused. Was this Nie Baihong trying to absolve himself of the crime? Since you insist on shouldering the responsibility, that would be great. Hastily, Wu Qi took a step forward, cupped his fist and bowed to the 5 sect elders, who were sitting on the ground about 100 feet away from him. 5 sect elders, I'm really sorry. After all, 5 sect elders had the advantage in numbers, and they had joined hands to bully Wu Qi's master. No matter how you look at it, it was not justifiable. Therefore, the reason why Wu Qi struck out with his sword was because he wanted to share some of the burden for master. But, I never expected that the 5 sect elders, who are mighty human immortals of Jin Dan sect, are actually so useless. Breathing out a long sigh, Wu Qi kept shaking his head and said with mixed emotions, today, I've made a name for myself with just one battle. With just one sword strike, I've wounded 5 human immortals of Jin Dan's sect. How delightful. Wu Qi's words were too harsh, and he did not leave any face for the 5 sect elders. Shangguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders were injured both internally and externally, and their injuries were so severe that it would take them at least a year and a half of recuperation to fully recover. After hearing Wu Qi's harsh words, all 5 sect elders coughed out a mouthful of blood once again. The color of the blood they coughed out this time was very similar to the color of their sword beams. Obviously, their prime blood essence was coughed out because of their extreme anger. Looking at the scene, even though Wu Qi had the intention to stir up some trouble, he dared not to make any noise. If he really angered 1 or 2 human immortals of Jin Dan realm to death, even if Nie Baihong had the intention to make use of him, he would never protect him. Immediately, Wu Qi lowered his head and took a few steps back obediently, placing both hands behind his back and pretending to be a good person. Nie Baihong grinned coldly. But, when he was about to say something, an extremely heavy pressure suddenly came from the entrance of Heaven's Will Palace. An old man clad in a long black robe, on which 3 flood dragons were embroidered with purple threads, was seen walking step by step into Heaven's Will Palace. He was surrounded by a ring of faintly discernible sword beams. From time to time, the sound of metal clashing could be heard coming out from the ring of sword beams. Wherever the old man passed by, the ground within a circumference of 3 feet was turned into powder. Upon seeing the old man, Nie Baihong's expression turned extremely unsightly immediately. On the other side, Shangguan Yuhong and the other 4 sect elders acted as if they had just seen their savior. With an unknown strength that came from nowhere, and disregarding the frightening sword wounds on their chests, they stood up from the ground. Chi cupped his fist and bowed to the old man. "Grand Elder, please uphold justice for us." An old man clad in black robe, who had a bushy beard, a dark complexion, a pair of deep eyes, thick eyebrows, and a square face, walked slowly until he was about 100 feet away from Nie Baihong. He glared at Wu Qi with a cold gaze. Suddenly, Nie Baihong took a step to the side and stood in front of Wu Qi. A light ringing that could only be produced when 2 sharp swords collided with each other rang out in the air. The casual glare from the old man was equal to shooting a sword at Wu Qi. If not because Nie Baihong stood in front of Wu Qi, with Wu Qi's current overall strength, there was no way he could find out where the attack came from. A layer of fine hair on the back of Wu Qi's neck stood straight up. When the old man glared at him just now, he could clearly sense the aura of death. If not because Nie Baihong had blocked the stare from the old man, even though he had inherited countless mystic techniques from Scroll of Stealing, Wu Qi reckoned he would at least be severely wounded and waiting for death. The old man was a frightening man who could decide whether Wu Qi would live or die at the current stage. Cautiously, Wu Qi took a step back. At the same time, he performed an incantation gesture with both hands that were placed behind his back. 90% of the blood essence in his internal organs began to boil and burn. He had activated the mystic technique for escaping, and an enormous force began to flow through his meridians. If this old man showed even the slightest hostility to Wu Qi again, Wu Qi would flee at the fastest speed without saying a word. After that, he would focus on cultivating and form the Jin Dan, then he would come back and seek revenge from this old man. However, as he failed to kill Wu Qi with just a glare, it seemed this old man had lost his interest in Wu Qi. He coughed lightly, then said with an indifferent voice, "This is getting out of hand. Baihong, this is getting out of hand. How dare your disciple offend my sect elder like this? As his master, it seems like you haven't taught him enough." Nie Baihong stared at the old man coldly and said, "Why did Grand Elder say that? Why do I need Grand Elder to remind me how to teach my disciple?" Suddenly, the old man laughed. With a strange, hoarse voice mixed with gentleness, he said, "I'm your father, why can't I teach you anything?" Wu Qi's heart skipped a beat. So, this old man was Yen Li, the Grand Elder of Heaven Breaking Sword sect together with Nie Yaonu? the third prince of Yan Qijuan, the crown prince of Great Yan Dynasty, and the third brother of Princess Xianglu? Chapter 92. With a complicated expression, Yan Li stared at the 5 vague sword shadows hovering above Niayanu's head. He said with a dry voice, "You actually managed to complete the Unity of Sword Energy's script of 5 elements, even though you're missing the earth and fire sword techniques? Hee, the hard work you've put into secluded cultivation for the past 100 years is indeed not in vain." Yan Li sighed lightly, lowered his voice and said gently, "Yaonu, since you're the one who begged for mercy for this kid, what else can I say? Let's just forget about this trivial matter. In the future, as long as he doesn't stir up any troubles in heaven-breaking sword sect, I can guarantee that no one will touch even a finger of his." Right when Wu Qi was about to leave, a soft, sweet, yet emotionless voice was heard coming from afar. Shangguan Yuhong's face turned extremely unsightly. Yan Li snorted lightly, turned to look at Shangguan Yuhong and asked, "Are you serious?" After taking 3 steps back, Wu Qi was about to activate the innate escape art of burning blood spirit water. Among all the escape arts of innate water element, this was the escape art that consumed the most vital energy, placed the heaviest burden on one's body, and had the most disastrous price. However, it was also the escape art with the strongest effect among all the escape art of innate water element. With Wu Qi's current cultivation of meridian cultivating tier, once he used this escape art, unless he was confronted by an earth immortal of nascent soul realm, no one could stop him. Nia Yaonu said coolly, "Although the Unity of Sword Energy's script of 5 elements is still missing the sword techniques of earth and fire elements, but hard work pays off. Mother has almost completed it, and I'll teach it to you later." She paused for a brief moment, then sneered and said, "Don't be afraid, little kid named Wu Qi. With me here, who dares to touch even a single hair of yours? Yan Li, are you the one who wants this little kid to cripple 1 leg, 1 arm, and 1 eye?" Yan Li sighed lightly, then slowly raised his right hand and pressed it towards Shangguan Yuhong's chest. The invisible sword intent surged out crazily. Shangguan Yuhong let out a miserable howl, as a finger-sized, transparent wound was left on her chest. A stream of blood shot out from her back and hit the wall of the hall, which was several hundred feet away. Yan Li stared at Shangguan Yuhong, whose face had turned deathly pale, and said indifferently, "Since I can create you, I can also kill you. The next time you talk to me, you must tell me everything clearly. Do not hide any details." In fact, the hazy sword qi had even circled around his neck 3 times, easily chopping off his head. Just now, Yan Li had been on the brink of death. It would be strange if he could look good. Nia Baihong just kept grinning coldly, as if he had not heard Yan Li's words. As a human immortal, Jean Dan had a very strong life force. Although there was a transparent wound on her chest, Yan Li had a good sense of propriety in his attack. He did not hurt any vital internal organs. Therefore, Shangguan Yuhong could still swing her body and bow to Yan Li, hastily responding to him. Upon hearing Shangguan Yuhong's words, Yan Li's expression turned uglier and uglier. His face was already dark, and now it was as black as ink. He looked at Wu Qi coldly and asked indifferently, "Wu Qi, is what Elder Shangguan said true? Kill yourself, and I'll let you reincarnate as a broken soul." All of a sudden, the dark green sword wind that filled the entire hall condensed, transforming into a hazy sword beam and thrust whistling out, thrusting straight towards Yan Li's chest. Wu Qi sneered. Yan Li's way of doing things was at least 100 times worse than Shangguan Yuhong and the others. Shangguan Yuhong merely wanted to kill Wu Qi with her flying sword, but Yan Li simply wanted Wu Qi to kill himself. He didn't even want to waste the energy of using his flying sword to kill someone. In Yan Li's eyes, a small potato like Wu Qi was just an ant that could be killed by him with a single word. Nia Yanu giggled, stared at Yan Li and said, "Yan Li, do you understand what I just said? Not only the matter of Wu Qi, but also the matters of heaven-breaking sword sect in the future. Otherwise, I, Nia Yanu, will fight you to the death." Hiss. Nya Yaonu laughed mockingly and said, "Me, pleading for him? Since I, Nya Yaonu, married you 600 years ago, when have I ever pleaded for anyone? Yanli, you think too highly of yourself. Since the day Baihong was born, I've sworn that I'll never beg for help again in my life." Scroll of stealing, a great thieving technique that aims at the Tao of the heaven and earth. How could this technique of escaping be something trivial? In order to be a good thief and great thieving, you have to make sure that you won't be caught by the owner. Otherwise, you will be captured alive with just one mistake. What else can you steal? What else can you steal? She threw her head back and let out 3 long laughs, then spun and walked towards the outside of Heaven's Will Palace. Yanli, the Grand Elder of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect, was indeed worthy of being the grandson of Yen Dan. With a bottle of medicinal powder casually taken out by Yanli, the Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect's Grand Elder, within the span of 2 to 3 breaths, the wounds on the chests of Shengguan Yuhong and the others were healed. The few spirit pills he gave them had even healed more than half of the internal injuries of the few elders in just a blink of an eye. Their consumed blood essence was recovering at a speed that could be sensed by Wuqi's divine sense. Hiss. Once again, Nya Yaonu let out a cold sneer and said, "You know you're not, so why are you still trying to flatter yourself? Yanli, how could you give birth to a son like Baihong? With your character?" Among the few elders, Shengguan Yuhong was the most eloquent one. With a cold and expressionless face, she told Wuqi everything that had happened to Wuqi and Wuqi. However, similar to Wuqi's ability to distort the truth, Shengguan Yuhong had also pushed all the blame onto Wuqi. According to her, everything was caused by Wuqi, and Wuqi had become a treacherous villain who sneaked into Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect with evil intentions. Cutting off one of his arms and one of his legs, and gouging out one of his eyeballs, didn't that make him a cripple? No one knew where the sword-quenching cold pond at the back of the mountain was, but obviously, it was an extremely dangerous place. Wuqi was not crazy, nor was he an idiot. He would not do as Yanli said. He gave Yanli a strange smile, as the boiling blood essence in his body suddenly transformed into a stream of clear water and circulated through his entire body. Abruptly, he took 3 steps back. Suddenly, Nya Baihong laughed out loud and said, "Grand Elder, Shengguan Yuhong, have forgotten to tell you one thing. Wuqi did not come to Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect with evil intentions. It was Princess Zhanglu who sent someone to me, and asked me to personally accept him as my disciple. Grand Elder, since you want to kill Wuqi, I hope Grand Elder can personally go to Princess Zhanglu and explain everything, so that I won't be in a difficult situation here." Amidst the strong wind formed by countless strands of sword energies, a petite and slender figure slowly revealed itself. Wuqi had a clear look at her. It was a lady, clad in a simple and crude long dress made of black linen, with the edges of the dress being patched. She was not wearing any ornament, and looked clean and simple, like a wild grass growing in the mountains. The lady had a pretty face, and a beautiful visage. Judging from her appearance, she looked like a teenage girl in her early 20s. However, her long white hair hung straight down to her ankles, and the weariness in her eyes and brows made her look like an old man who was several hundred years old. She was the former sect leader of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect, and one of the 2 grand elders of the current Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect, Nya Yaonu. Amidst the strong wind of sword energies that filled the sky, Nya Yaonu, with 5 vague sword shadows looming above her head, walked slowly into Heaven's Will Palace. Like an old hen protecting her chicks, she naturally stood in front of Nya Baihong and shielded him. Yanli stood stiffly where he was, with cold sweat rolling down from his forehead. He fixed his gaze on Nya Yaonu, and his eyes suddenly turned blood red. After a long while, Yanli suddenly opened his mouth and coughed out a stream of blood. The silver sword beam was actually a lower-tier magical treasure flying sword, the Silver Dragon Sword, which Yanli had cultivated with his life for over 700 years. Unexpectedly, it was shattered into pieces by Nya Yaonu with just a single sword strike. Yan Li's prime magical treasure, which had nearly fused with his nascent divinity, was destroyed, and the injury he suffered this time was not light. Yan Li cried out in shock. He opened his mouth and spat out a silver beam, greeting the blurry sword beam. A loud explosive noise rang out, as the silver beam was shattered into pieces. The blurry sword beam shot straight to Yan Li's side, wheeling 3 times around his neck at high speed, before dispersing into countless sword energies that blotted the sky. Wu Qi opened his mouth, puffed up his internal energy, and let out 3 wild laughs with all his energy. After that, he strode forward with steady steps, humming a little tune and followed closely behind Nie Baihong. Fortunately, Wu Qi did not have a tail, or else his tail would have stood straight up into the sky. Shangguan Yuhong bowed her head, cowering and daring not to say a word. After dealing with the injuries of a few sect elders, and feeding some medicine to Qin Shuwen, Yan Li looked at Nie Baihong and said indifferently, "What is going on here? I've only stayed in a secluded cultivation for 6 months, studying the sword technique. Could it be that heaven-breaking sword sect is going to split up? A mighty sect leader is fighting with 5 sect elders, and a disciple of sect leader dares to mock and ridicule the sect elders? How rude." Nie Baihong threw his head back and let out 3 wild laughs, then followed behind Nie Yaonu with a complacent and almost arrogant manner. In the eyes of others, the reason why Wu Qi took 3 steps back was because his legs were weak and he could not stand straight. However, Wu Qi himself knew very well that 90% of the blood essence in his internal organs had turned into clear water, and the enormous energy contained in this blood essence had filled and surged in his meridians. With just a thought in his mind, he could transform into a stream of blood and fly far away. Yan Li, the current sect leader of heaven-breaking sword sect, is Baihong. As a grand elder, you can only enjoy an empty title, but if you want to meddle in the internal affairs of the sect, you will need me, Nie Yaonu, to stay alive. Along with the voice, countless tiny and fragmented sword energies came shooting from outside the main entrance of Heaven's Will Palace. In just a blink of an eye, they had transformed into a wild wind that swept across the entire Heaven's Will Palace. Amidst loud sizzling noises, a layer of the ground was removed from the ground. Yan Li opened her mouth and coughed out another mouthful of blood. The face of Nie Baihong, who had always been cold and arrogant, suddenly turned gentle. He bowed respectfully at Nie Yanu's back, then asked with a deep and gentle voice, "Mother, why did you come out from your secluded cultivation?" "This is just a trivial matter, I can still handle it." Yan Li was so angry that his body was trembling. Abruptly, he leaped 8 feet high into the air, pointed his finger at Nie Yaonu and said furiously, "Why can't I meddle in this matter? I'm Baihong's father." Nie Yaonu kept her hands under her sleeves, stared at Yan Li indifferently and said, "Do you understand now? I'm not asking you to spare Wu Qi's life, but I won't allow you to touch even a single hair of his. And Shangguan Yuhong, all of you listen to me. I don't care what kind of grudge you have with Wu Qi, but as long as I'm alive, you are not allowed to touch him. If anyone dares to disobey me, I, Nie Yaonu, will kill him myself." Sighing softly, Yan Li retracted his hand. His long brows that were as thick as blades were tightly knitted together. "That girl Zidan asked for a favor. Hehe, Wu Qi, what method do you have to make that unruly little girl speak up for you? However, even though Zidan is taking care of you, you still have to be severely punished for violating the sect rule of heaven-breaking sword sect. Break one of your arms and one of your legs, gouge out one of your eyes, or go to the cold pool of sword quenching at the back of the mountain and meditate for 3 days. Make your choice." Shangguan Yuhong and all the other sect elders had a complacent smile on their faces, while Qin Shuwen, who had just woken up, was grinning coldly. If Yan Li wanted Wu Qi dead, Wu Qi would be dead for sure. In heaven-breaking sword sect, Yan Li's words were more effective than the imperial edict. The life and death of the disciples, the reward and punishment, were all decided by him. Chapter 93. After they came out from Heaven's Will Palace, Nie Yaonu looked up into the sky with both hands folded under her sleeves. Suddenly, a dark green cloud rushed out from under her feet, carrying Wu Qi and Nie Baiheng up into the sky. The cloud carried the three of them, flying straight towards the highest peak of Mount White Sun at the speed of a shooting star. Near the mountainside of the highest peak of the White Sun Mountain, on a precipitous, golden cliff, hundreds of oddly shaped pines were growing here and there. These pine trees were shaped like flood dragons, with their roots firmly rooted in the cliff. Their trunks and crowns poked out at an angle, absorbing the misty energies that pervaded the air around the cliff. It was a truly breathtaking place. A couple dozens of white cranes were building their nests on these thick and sturdy pine trees. When Nie Yaonu brought Wu Qi and Nie Baiheng closer, these white cranes let out joyful cries, flapped their huge wings and soared into the sky, wheeling and wheeling around Nie Yaonu's cloud, as if they were welcoming the return of Nie Yaonu. Right in the middle of the cliff, at a place several thousand feet away from the ground and the top of the mountain, there was a small flatland. A few ancient pine trees could be seen growing on it, and a large field of exotic flowers and plants could be seen. A few stone blocks that were not finely processed were placed under the pine trees, and at the end of the flatland was a 30 feet tall cave abode. A pale golden plaque was inlaid on the stone wall above the abode, engraved with 4 large characters: "The sword originates from the heart." Wu Qi gave the entrance of the cave a glance, from which a dense natural energy kept gushing out, then quickly turned his head away, not daring to look at it for too long. This cave abode should be the most important place of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect, the place where Nie Yaonu inherited the legacy of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect. When it came to such an important place, Wu Qi would come and explore it when he had sufficient overall strength. It was not only because of the instruction in Scroll of Stealing, but also a habit Wu Qi had developed after he joined the Underhand sect back on Earth. When facing the goal of the future, it was better not to show too much interest. Nie Yaonu landed on the cloud, walked to the foot of the ancient pine tree, and sat on a stone block. Nie Baiheng did not say anything, and just sat on the stone block in front of Nie Yaonu. Wu Qi looked to the left and right, and it seemed that he had no place to sit here. Therefore, he had no choice but to stand in front of Nie Yaonu and Nie Baiheng, letting Nie Yaonu examine him from head to toe with narrowed eyes. Wu Qi calmed his mind and put on a pure and kind smile, and allowed Nie Yaonu to examine him for a full 15 minutes without showing any unnatural or uneasy expression. Only then did Nie Yaonu nod her head satisfyingly. She said in an indifferent tone, "You have a calm temperament, and neither arrogant nor rash. It's worth it for me to protect you this time." Laughing dryly, Wu Qi asked in a low voice, "What if I can't be accepted by Grand Elder?" Both of Nie Yaonu's hands were still hidden under her sleeves. She said in a very natural manner, "If you are really weak, you should count yourself lucky that I saved you today. In the future, whether you live or die has nothing to do with me. You're not my son. Don't tell me you want me to take care of you all day, protect you, and stand up for you when something happens. There is no such logic in this world." Wu Qi pondered over what Nie Yaonu said. She was right. He was not Nie Yaonu's son. Obviously, Nie Yaonu wanted to teach Yen Li a lesson by protecting him today. He was just an excuse. After today, his life and death had nothing to do with Nie Yaonu. Although Nie Yaonu had promised to protect him, if he really vanished from this world, Nie Yaonu would never waste any effort to avenge him. Laughing dryly again, Wu Qi withdrew the enormous power that was about to explode in his body and asked cautiously, "Supreme Elder brought me here and found that I seem to be the kind of person who can be trained. May I know what advice does Senior have for me?" Nie Yaonu pondered for a brief moment. Without paying any attention to Wu Qi, she turned to Nie Baiheng and asked, "Baiheng, what is the background of this Wu Qi? At such a young age, his cultivation base is not bad. But, how audacious is he?" Nie Baiheng smiled, then told Nie Yaonu about Wu Qi's background. He told her that Wu Qi was the hanger-on of Lu Qingfeng, and it was Princess Zhanglu who asked him to join Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect, and the fact that today was the first day Wu Qi came to Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect to attend a lecture, and how he was dragged into such a huge storm. Nia Baihong told her everything he knew. Nia Baihong even told Wu Qi about Lu Chengfeng's background. He was the nominal eldest son of Lu clan of Liang Kingdom, the illegitimate son of Yan Buji, who had just arrived at Ji City from the Lu Kingdom and inherited the title of Duke Yan Lu. Obviously, Nia Baihong had spent a lot of effort in investigating Wu Qi and Lu Chengfeng. After all, he was the sect leader of Heaven-Breaking Sword sect. It was not difficult for him to find out the background of a new noble of great Yan dynasty. Is that so? Nia Yaonu drooped her eyelids, bowed her head and pondered. The mountain breeze blew past, and her long white hair danced behind her head. The sunlight shone on her white hair, and it faintly glowed like silver. What had Nia Yaonu gone through that made her have such a strange look? Wu Qi's mind was spinning rapidly. Very soon, he came up with a few possible scenarios. From Nia Baihong's surname, from Nia Baihong's attitude towards Yanli, from the conflict between Nia Yaonu and Yanli, from the strange atmosphere in Heaven-Breaking Sword sect, and from the indistinct confrontation between Nia Baihong, the sect leader, and all the sect elders, Wu Qi felt he was getting closer and closer to the truth, and he even had a bolder guess. However, the things he guessed were too frightening, and he dared not to confirm if his guess was correct or not. However, he was sure of one thing. Judging from the confrontation between Nia Yaonu and Yanli, he, Wu Qi, had a bright future in Heaven-Breaking Sword sect. Vaguely, Wu Qi had a premonition that as long as he managed his business well in Heaven-Breaking Sword sect, he would be able to safely cultivate until he reached the Jin Dan realm. When he thought of this, Wu Qi's body became taller, and the smile on his face became more impeccable. His eyes had become pure and flawless, filled with an innocent wildness, like those wild beasts living in the mountains. Yes, the eyes Wu Qi had disguised were filled with wildness, just like those wild beasts, a wildness that came from their innate instinct, and not the wildness that was cultivated with a filthy heart. Nia Yaonu, who seemed to be pondering with her head lowered, was actually secretly observing Wu Qi with her divine ability. When she saw the pure wildness in Wu Qi's eyes that had not been tainted by the mortal world, a faint smile finally emerged on her face, and she was satisfied with what she saw. After listening to Nia Baihong's explanation of Wu Qi and Lu Chengfeng's background, Nia Yaonu could at least be sure that Wu Qi was a useful man. Because he had nothing to do with those people whom Nia Yaonu dreaded and hated. Although he was recommended by Princess Zhanglu to join Heaven-Breaking Sword sect, Princess Zhanglu was not on the list of people whom Nia Yaonu dreaded and hated. She was just a young girl who was overly spoiled. Although she had some power in her hands, she was not worthy of her attention. Nia Yaonu pursed her red lips and smiled. When she smiled, the weariness and heaviness in her eyes immediately vanished without a trace, making her look like a blooming orchid in a valley, giving one a wonderful feeling of fragrance. Although Wu Qi knew that Nia Yaonu was an old lady who lived for several hundred years, he was still struck dumb by her smile. Now that she was like this, how charming was she when she was still a young girl. He is a good boy. Nia Yaonu said coolly, "Go back and tell your Duke Yanlu that if he has the intention to cultivate, I can make an exception and ask Baihong to take him as his true disciple, and teach him the true essence of Heaven-Breaking Sword sect sword technique." Wu Qi was taken aback, then he quickly said, "Our young master has the dual element of earth and gold, and he is more willing to study the Tao of formation." A bright gleam burst out from Nia Yaonu's eyes. She nodded and said, "That's good. Everyone under the heaven knows that the sword technique of Heaven-Breaking Sword sect is the strongest in Great Yan dynasty, but no one knows that the Tao of formation is also in the legacy of the immortal I inherited. However, the Tao of formation is too difficult, and I have no time to study it. Therefore, Heaven-Breaking Sword sect doesn't have this legacy." Looking at Wu Qi, Nia Yaonu said in a deep voice, "Ask Duke Yanlu to join Heaven-Breaking Sword sect. I'll personally teach him the script of heaven patching formation, which is on par with the Heaven-Breaking Sword technique." Wu Qi was taken aback, then he bowed deeply to Nia Yaonu and said, "On behalf of our young master, Wu Qi thanks Grand Elder for your kindness. But, regarding this matter, Wu Qi can't make the decision on his own. Our young master has to make the decision himself. Nia Yaonu said in a deep voice, all right, Bai Hong will send you back to Ji City later. You can also take Duke Yen Lu as your disciple on the way. Not allowing Wu Qi to refute, it seemed like Nia Yaonu had made up her mind to take Lu Qingfeng as her disciple. Judging from her words, she wouldn't allow Lu Qingfeng and Wu Qi to reject her suggestion. Wu Qi answered helplessly. It looked like Lu Qingfeng was going to be forced to do something beyond his ability. After deciding the matter of Lu Qingfeng becoming Lu Qingfeng's disciple, Nia Yaonu continued asking, Wu Qi, how is your bone structure and innate talent assessed by Heaven's Will Palace? Without wasting any time, Wu Qi told Nia Yaonu everything about his bone structure and innate talent tested by Haoying Xiong. There was nothing worth hiding. Apart from the frightening 5 feet innate nascent embryo, although the rest of his bone structure and innate talent were not bad, they were not the most outstanding geniuses. Thus, there was nothing to hide. However, Nia Yaonu was full of praises towards Wu Qi's bone structure and innate talent. It seemed like she was very satisfied with Wu Qi's bone structure and innate talent. She muttered to herself for a while before slowly saying, fine, I like your temperament and background very much. Bai Hong can really take you as his disciple. We cultivators have our own Taoist name. You can just name yourself. Taoist name? Looking at Nia Yaonu's serious expression, Wu Qi did not think there was anything to be nervous about. Wasn't a Taoist name just a nickname outside of one's real name? Wu Qi recalled Wu Wang's nickname when he was in the army. He said casually, then I'll call you Greedy Wolf. Taoist Greedy Wolf, what do you think, Grand Elder? Although it was just a random Taoist name, it made Nia Yanu's body tremble. She stared at Wu Qi with surprise for a long while, then suddenly burst out laughing, so, this is your destiny, and also the destiny of that sword. Well, this sword of Greedy Wolf has finally met its master today. Nia Yaonu moved her hand, pulled out a strange-looking sheathless sword from nowhere, and handed it over to Wu Qi. When the sword was thrust out, an invisible cold air swept across the surroundings. Wu Qi's body was struck by the cold air, causing all the pores on his body to shrink, and making him shiver. This sword is called Greedy Wolf, one of the 5 flying swords I found when I accidentally stumbled into an immortal's cave while picking herbs. I used the Shadow Hook sword, Bai Hong used the Grand White sword, Yan Li took away the Purple Revered sword and the Grand sword and offered them to Crown Prince Yan Qijuan, and the only sword I kept from him is Greedy Wolf. Nia Yaonu casually threw the sword to Wu Qi. Then, as if she suddenly recalled something unpleasant, she said with a gloomy face, since you called yourself Greedy Wolf today, it seems you have a destiny with this sword. Well, go now. Just be more cautious in the future. Unwilling to talk any further, Nia Yaonu sent a few words to Nia Bai Hong through voice transmission. After that, she flicked her sleeve and unleashed a strong gust of dark green wind, sending both Wu Qi and Nia Bai Hong several dozens of miles away. When they finally landed on the ground, they were already outside of White Sun Mountain. Chapter 94. The sword of Greedy Wolf was neither made of gold nor iron. Its main material was the 10,000 years whirlpool ice jade, a miraculous item from the outer space, combined with 48 other materials that did not belong to the category of metals, and cast with the flame of extreme yin. The length of the sword was 4 feet and 2 inches, the width of a palm, the thickness of a finger, and the weight of 360 kilograms. The body of the sword was pitch black, and it felt like a piece of wood or stone. Strange patterns could be seen wriggling and stretching on the body of the sword, twisting into countless mysterious runes. When all the runes merged together, they transformed into a total of 49 wolf heads on the body of the sword, opening their mouths and roaring. The number of these wolf heads followed the number of the Great Evolution, and with the true form of the Greedy Wolf, it could trigger the murderous and greedy energies in the heaven and earth, giving this lower-tier magical treasure flying sword a little more power. Without a doubt, the person who forged this sword was an expert in the field of item crafting. In Wu Qi's opinion, although the material of this sword was not bad, the technique used to forge it was very experienced. The material of this sword did not match the technique used to forge it. According to Wu Qi's estimation, based on the technique used by the person who forged this sword, he could at least forge an upper-tier spirit item. However, he only used the 10,000 years whirlpool ice jade to forge it into a lower-tier magical treasure. However, because of the instinct of an expert in item crafting, the person who forged this sword had spent a great amount of time and effort on the sword of Greedy Wolf, making this lower-tier magical treasure nearly perfect. There were 49 acceleration formations in the sword, 49 formations that could increase its sharpness and flexibility, and the core of all the formations was the 9 Serenities soul-devouring formation. Normally, this formation would only appear on a spirit item. However, the person who forged this sword had brazenly fused this powerful formation into the sword of Greedy Wolf, allowing this lower-tier magical treasure to possess a power close to that of a spirit item. The only function of the 9 Serenities soul-devouring formation was that after the sword of Greedy Wolf killed its opponent, it would absorb the blood essence and soul of the enemy and fuse it into the sword, constantly enhancing its spirituality and quality, giving it a limitless development potential in the future. With the miraculous technique found in Scroll of Stealing, as long as he could find some excellent materials, after the sword of Greedy Wolf had absorbed enough blood essence and soul, he could upgrade it endlessly. Riding on the single-horned deer and fiddling with the heavy sword of Greedy Wolf, Wu Qi nodded his head pleasantly. Compared to sword of Greedy Wolf, the autumn water sword given to him by Nie Baihong was simply trash. If not for Nie Baihong, who was riding on a flying sword and following him, Wu Qi wished he could pull out the autumn water sword and give it to the secret agent of scouting office who led him here as a favor. After fiddling with the newly acquired sword for a while, Wu Qi made up his mind. He bit the tip of his tongue and forced out 9 drops of prime blood essence, fusing them into the sword. After that, he sent a thread of divine sense into the sword, establishing a preliminary telepathic connection with the sword. With his current cultivation base, before he could cultivate the true flame of Samadhi, it was impossible for him to truly refine the sword of Greedy Wolf, a lower-grade magical treasure. However, by using the mystic technique found in Scroll of Stealing, he naturally had other ways to freely control a lower-grade magical treasure. With the sword of Greedy Wolf, Wu Qi's ability of stirring up troubles and escaping had been greatly improved. High up in the sky, behind a thick layer of clouds, Nie Baihong was riding on a white beam and following closely behind Wu Qi. As Nie Yaonu had made the decision to accept Lu Qingfeng as her disciple and inherit the arts of heaven-patching formation of heaven-breaking sword sect, naturally, Nie Baihong had no choice but to personally make the trip. At the same time, he could save Wu Qi the trouble of being killed by some living immortal of Jin Dan realm on his way back. Flying high up in the sky, Nie Baihong saw Wu Qi spit out 9 drops of prime blood essence and sprayed them onto the sword of Greedy Wolf. He could not help but twitch his lips. For a cultivator, the prime blood essence was the foundation of their cultivation. With Nie Baihong's cultivation base, it was already a heartache for him to spend 1 or 2 drops of prime blood essence to refine a new magical treasure. Therefore, it was an incomprehensible and crazy behavior for Wu Qi to spend 9 drops of prime blood essence at once. Shaking his head, Nie Baihong thought that Wu Qi was overjoyed because he had obtained a lower-tier magical treasure, and did not suspect anything else. If he knew that the prime blood essence was not a problem for Wu Qi, perhaps he would be so shocked that his teeth would fall off. The single-horned deer was running at an incredible speed. Not long after that, Wu Qi had arrived at the city gate of Ji City. After greeting the guide, when Wu Qi was about to enter the city gate, a large group of people suddenly dashed out from the city gate, rushing towards Wu Qi. Before Wu Qi could get a clear look at the purpose of these people, a cold breeze suddenly came piercing towards his thigh. A middle-aged man with a skinny face and a wretched appearance was holding a small dagger in his hand, thrusting it forcefully towards Wu Qi's thigh. As this middle-aged man did not have any cultivation base, Wu Qi just sneered, raised his leg and kicked the man away. A miserable howl rang out, and suddenly, Wu Qi realized something was not right. How could this man's body be so light? Right when the tip of Wu Qi's foot touched the man, he was sent flying 70 to 80 feet away like a feather being blown away by a strong wind, slamming his head onto the wall of the city gate. Half of his head was smashed, and his brain and blood were splattering all over the ground. The group of people who dashed out from the city gate just now immediately burst into an uproar, rushing towards Wu Qi. This bastard actually dares to commit murder in broad daylight under the bright sky. My lords, look carefully. This guy is killing someone in broad daylight. Wu Qi was taken aback. Only now did he have a clear look at the group of people who came out from a few duty rooms of city guards on both sides of the city gate. They were a group of bailiffs, clad in black official outfits, each wearing a tall, square-shaped hat on their head, with a blood-red feather sticking on the left brim of the hat. These bailiffs were all dressed in a tight outfit, and a long blade hung on their waist. Obviously, they were the bailiffs under the jurisdiction of Great Yan Dynasty's Criminal and Justice Department, who were responsible for arresting thieves and maintaining public order. There were more than 100 bailiffs who came out from the duty rooms. When they saw Wu Qi killed the middle-aged man with a single kick, these bailiffs dashed forward in a disorderly manner, thrusting a few alloy chains towards Wu Qi's head and face. The alloy chain, which was as thick as an egg, was whipped by these patrolmen, who all had strong inner force cultivation, with all their strength. Even an iron pillar would be broken, let alone an ordinary body of flesh and blood. Even with Wu Qi's current cultivation base, he would never let these iron chains hit him like this. Coincidentally, the sword of Greedy Wolf was still in his hand. Wu Qi casually swung the sword, unleashing a dark beam that flashed across with a faintly discernible howl of a wolf. Amidst a series of hissing noises, a few sturdy bailiffs felt their hands become lighter. As they had exerted too much force, they were unable to stop their momentum and fell to the ground, rolling a few times in a miserable state. Holding the sword in his hand, Wu Qi cried out sternly, "Wait! What are you doing? This man tried to kill me first, don't blame me for fighting back." A middle-aged bailiff, with dark circles under his eyes and a gloomy face, strode out from the crowd. He pointed his finger at Wu Qi and snapped, "Bullshit! This man is obviously an innocent man. You killed an innocent man with a kick, and you think you are in the right? He tried to kill you first, but what did he use to kill you? Where is the weapon?" Wu Qi quickly turned to look at the dead middle-aged man. The dagger held tightly in the man's hand was long gone. Wu Qi's heart sank, as he knew he had fallen into a trap. After spending a few years in the underhand sect, and with all the experience from Wu Wang, Wu Qi knew that these bailiffs were here for him. They had used a man's life to set up a deadly trap for him. Before Wu Qi could figure out a way to deal with this, the middle-aged bailiff sneered and snapped, "You have nothing to say now? Somebody, bring him to the Court of Criminal and Justice and interrogate him with torture. Let's find out who exactly he is relying on to have the courage to kill someone in the street. A man's life was taken by him with a kick. If we don't severely punish such a wicked man with the national law, we will be letting the heaven and earth down, and the common people down below. Don't you think so?" The city gate through which Wu Qi entered the city was filled with many common people. At this moment, both sides of the city gate were surrounded by many common people. Hearing the bailiff's scolding, someone in the crowd shouted, "Bravo!" Then, nearly 1,000 common people applauded and cheered. There were even some rangers armed with swords and sabers, who were filled with righteous indignation and were about to arrest Wu Qi. A few rangers with the strongest cultivation base and the strongest courage had already drawn their swords and approached Wu Qi. The bailiffs from the Court of Criminal and Justice had a gloomy and complacent smile on their faces. A man's life was tied to Wu Qi's throat. Unless he wanted to flee for his life, he could only follow them to the Court of Criminal and Justice. As long as he entered the Court of Criminal and Justice, wouldn't Wu Qi's little life be in their hands? The clatter of hooves was heard, as two teams of scouting officers, clad in green soft armors, rode their horses and blocked off both exits of the city gate. Among these scouting officers, Wu Qi saw Qin Qingshui's distinctive donkey face. Standing next to Qin Qingshui, who had a gloomy expression, Hao Yingfeng, who was beaten up by Lu Qingfeng, was smiling complacently at Wu Qi. Behind these two men was Tuoba Haofeng, whose skin was greenish-purple. Obviously, he had not fully recovered from the frostbite. He too was smiling hideously at Wu Qi. Well, in just a short while, all the enemies Wu Qi had offended after he came to Ji City had gathered. The Court of Criminal and Justice had come to arrest Wu Qi, and the scouting officers had blocked off the city gate to prevent Wu Qi from escaping. Perhaps, Tuoba Haofeng's subordinates had even brought some forbidden weapons, such as ballistae, and were lying in ambush outside the city gate. Everything was coming one after another. Wu Qi breathed out a long sigh. Suddenly, he raised his head up and cried out furiously, "Master, please uphold justice for your disciple. Someone is trying to frame your disciple. They are not giving you any face." A blinding white light suddenly flashed across, as Nie Baihong, clad in a white cloak and with a gloomy expression that made him look like a ferocious ghost, suddenly appeared right next to Wu Qi. Nie Baihong glared at Qin Qingshui coldly, which made Qin Qingshui's body tremble, and he was so frightened that he fell off his mount and fell to the ground. After falling to the ground, Qin Qingshui didn't even let out a snort. He just kowtowed 3 times towards Nie Baihong, then spun and ran away. Hao Yingfeng and Tuoba Haofeng were struck dumb. Both of them sprung up from the ground at the same time, throwing themselves on the ground and kowtowing a few times as well. Ignoring the blood that kept flowing out from their broken foreheads, both of them turned around and ran away. Nie Baihong sneered, staring at those patrolmen from Court of Criminal and Justice, who were shivering with fear, and said, "You're framing my disciple. Do you have no respect for heaven-breaking sword sect?" The onlookers in the city gate cried out in alarm, then spun and fled. In just a blink of an eye, all of them were gone. Even the few wandering knights who wielded their blades and spears, wanting to capture Wu Qi alive, had vanished without a trace. Muffled thuds were heard, as nearly 100 patrolmen dropped to their knees at the same time. None of them dared to make a sound. Nie Baihong smiled arrogantly, then said with a deep voice, "30 of you who are the leaders, kill yourselves, and I won't hold your family members responsible for this." Before Wu Qi could stop him, he saw 30 patrolmen, led by the middle-aged patrolman, drew out their blades at the same time, crying out, "Thank you, old immortal, for your mercy." After that, they hacked their own necks with their blades. 30 heads flew high up into the sky, and blood splashed and stained the ground. Wu Qi was struck dumb by what he saw. Nie Baihong gave him an indifferent look, then cried out in a low voice, "What are you staring blankly for? Lead the way to Duke Yanluo." Throwing a glance at the 30 dead bodies lying on the ground, Wu Qi rode on his mount and continued forward without saying a word. "I'm not a good person, but you've touched my bottom line by killing that girl." Grinning coldly, Nie Baihong spun around and walked backward, looking at Wu Qi and saying mockingly, "You?" Nodding his head seriously, Wu Qi said in a serious tone, "Me? I'll definitely cultivate faster than you." Shaking his head gloomily, Nie Baihong smiled wryly and said, "It seems like I've taken in a disciple with an excessive sense of justice. Unfortunately, you're my disciple, and I want to use him to strengthen the core disciples of Heaven-Breaking Sword sect in the future. Since I can't kill you, what can I do?" Nie Baihong sighed faintly, bowed his head and pondered for a while. Then, he flew 9 feet closer to Wu Qi, walking side by side with Wu Qi. He breathed out a deep sigh and said coolly, "I'm curious as well. Why don't I kill you right now? That way, I can save a lot of time and effort. However, as you used to be very similar to me, I'll make an exception and tell you something." He raised his head up and looked at the sky, then pointed his finger out and unleashed a sword beam that killed the mount of the secret agent of Scouting Office, who acted as a guide for Wu Qi. The secret agent was sensible enough to jump down from the dead mount and stayed far behind Nie Baihong, not daring to take even half a step closer. Nie Baihong sighed lightly, then said coolly, "Yan Li is my mother's husband, and my surname is Nie. I've taken my mother's surname." Wu Qi turned his head and looked at Nie Baihong. He wanted to hear what kind of excuse this man was going to use to absolve himself of killing the girl on the pleasure boat. He swore that he would kill Nie Baihong, but since Nie Yaonu thought highly of him, and even gave him the sword of greedy wolf, Wu Qi could not do something like killing someone after receiving a favor from her. As a man, even if he was going to kill someone, he would have to make it clear first, and understand the reason thoroughly. He, Wu Qi, and his former master, Wu Wang, were not the kind of people who would kill someone without a reason. Nie Baihong's expression turned strange. His pupils were slightly dilated, and a thread of his soul had long gone somewhere. Using a tone that sounded like he was talking in his sleep, he slowly told Wu Qi something that happened a long time ago. He had to start from the time when Nie Yaonu inherited the legacy of heaven-breaking sword sect. Over 600 years ago, Nie Yaonu was just a herb gatherer from a small village outside of Ji City. She visited Mount White Sun all year round, harvesting herbs and selling them to the herb shops in Ji City. That year was also her lucky day. For the sake of harvesting a 5-colored ink heart grain, she used a rope to hang herself down from the cliff. For some unknown reason, perhaps it was because her foundation met the requirement, she entered the immortal's cave of sword stems from the heart, inherited the legacy of an immortal, and obtained the heaven-breaking sword technique and arts of heaven patching formation. As a commoner girl born in a mountain village, how could she know anything about the stakes? The news about Nie Yaonu obtaining an immortal fate spread out very quickly. At that time, the ruler of Great Yan Dynasty, led by the crown prince, Yan Qijuan, paid a visit to her. Under the name of the righteous cause of the country, the ignorant Nie Yaonu became the imperial sinecure of Great Yan Dynasty. Great Yan Dynasty contributed money and manpower to establish heaven-breaking sword sect. Because of the restrictive spell set by the immortal, apart from Nie Yaonu, no one could obtain any information from the heaven-breaking sword technique and arts of heaven patching formation. Unless Nie Yaonu taught them personally, no one else in Great Yan Dynasty could obtain the corresponding cultivation technique. Therefore, Nie Yaonu, who had just started her cultivation, suddenly fainted after attending a banquet due to drunkenness. When she woke up, she was already sleeping with Yan Li, and both of them had become husband and wife. Some cliché but very effective methods were used one after another. For the safety of the mountain village, and for the safety of her childhood sweetheart, Nie Yaonu, who had lost her chastity to Yan Li, became husband and wife with Yan Li. Therefore, Yan Li naturally obtained the sword technique taught by Nie Yaonu. However, Nie Yaonu, who had gone through an unforeseen event, quickly became mature. She concealed the existence of arts of heaven patching formation, and the sword technique taught to Yan Li was missing the most essential part of unity of sword energies. And then, Wu Qi looked at Nie Baihong with a gossipy gaze, who had a gloomy expression on her face. He knew this kind of gaze could easily be misunderstood by others, and could easily irritate those who were sad. But, this was the bad memory that came from Lu Xiaobai's soul. In order for Wu Qi to get rid of this bad habit, he would need to put in a lot of effort, a very arduous effort. At least, when Wu Qi heard the gossip told by Nie Baihong, all the cells in his body were burning. What happened after that was very logical. Nie Yaonu, the childhood sweetheart of Nie Yaonu, who also joined heaven-breaking sword sect and obtained the inheritance of the sword technique, died in an accident when he had just formed his Jin Dan and was about to transcend his heavenly tribulation. He died quietly and without leaving any trace. At that time, Nie Yaonu was already pregnant, and the child could never be Yan Li's. From the moment Nie Yaonu became pregnant until she gave birth to Nie Baihong, Yan Li had been in a secluded cultivation, trying to break through the Jin Dan realm. When Yanli finally formed his Jin Dan realm and came out from his secluded cultivation, Nya Baihong had already begun to run all over the place. From the time I was born, until I became the sect leader of Heaven-Breaking Sword Sect, I've experienced 297 assassination attempts, almost one every year. Nya Baihong looked at Wu Qi, smiled faintly and said, I used to have 7 trusted disciples, who were 7 of your senior brothers. For the sake of protecting me, all of them were assassinated. I've stepped on their blood and flesh, and with great difficulty, I finally secured the position of sect leader. Nya Baihong sighed lightly, then continued in an indifferent tone, I have to kill. No matter who dares to disrespect me, even if it's just a little bit, I'll have to kill them. Those who submit to me will prosper, and those who oppose me will perish. Those who refuse to submit to me, I'll kill them with my sword. Only by killing until everyone under the heaven is afraid of me will I not be killed, and no one will have the courage to attack me. Nya Baihong looked at Wu Qi, shook his head and said, that girl on the pleasure boat sneezed in front of me. It's just a small matter, not worthy of death. However, the people of Great Yen Dynasty address me as Tai Bai God of Slaughter. If I don't kill her, I'll no longer be the God of Slaughter. Those who once wanted to kill me will come again with their swords. Therefore, I can only kill, keep on killing. With a pitiful look, Wu Qi gazed at Nya Baihong, who had a gloomy expression on his face. He sighed and said, you should have killed Yanli. Nya Baihong remained silent for a while, then lowered his voice and said, if I tell you that the people I want to kill the most are Yan Dan and Yan Qijuan, will you report it to the public? Suddenly, Nya Baihong let out a strange chuckle, looking at Wu Qi with an interested expression. After a brief moment of silence, Wu Qi shook his head and said, if you really want to kill Jing Ku, I'll report it to the public. As for Yan Dan and Yan Qijuan, I don't have any feelings for them. If Nya Baihong really wanted to kill that brave warrior, Wu Qi would definitely report it to the public. As for Yan Dan and Yan Qijuan, they were not Wu Qi's sons, so why would Wu Qi care about their life and death? Since they could do something like that to Nya Yaonu, it showed that they did not have a good moral standing. Nya Baihong laughed, a very happy laugh. Chief General Jing Ku. That is a man with bones of steel. He, throughout the entire Great Yen Dynasty, only he and Gao Jianli can be considered as a pair of foolishly good people. Ha, you're born to be my disciple. Wu Qi pondered for a brief moment, then looked at Nya Baihong and said, for the sake of that girl on the pleasure boat, after I form the Jin Dan, I'll stab you with my sword. As long as you don't die, I'll let this matter go. If you die, you'll pay for her life, and that will be the retribution from the heavenly Tao. Ask yourself, the Grand Supreme Elder is in a pitiful situation, but that girl is just like the Grand Supreme Elder in those years, she is just a weak girl. The smile on Nya Baihong's face froze. The bright gleam in his eyes became chaotic, and his body trembled. Suddenly, a mouthful of warm blood sprayed out from his mouth. He stared fixedly at Wu Qi and said with a deep voice, I see. Good, 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 after you form the Jin Dan, I'll no longer hide or defend myself. I'll use my corporeal body to receive a sword strike from you. Ask yourself, what a good, ask yourself. What a good Wu Qi, what a good Taoist greed. He threw his head back and let out 3 wild laughs, then suddenly lowered his voice and asked in a mysterious tone, for the sake of this ask yourself, do you want to know a secret related to Princess Xianglu? He, Princess Xianglu is on good terms with you now, but I don't want you to be killed and thrown into the moat. A secret related to Princess Xianglu? Wu Qi's face fell. Tell me, I'm listening. He cried with a low voice. Nya Baihong let out a few strange laughs, condensed his voice into a thin line and transmitted it into Wu Qi's ears. Upon hearing Nya Baihong's words, Wu Qi's face fell instantly. After a long while, Wu Qi let out a strange laugh. You're tuning into the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.